Plejadisch-Plejarische Kontaktberichte Block 14.
Introduction Contact Reports Volume/Issue, 14 pages, 262-307 Contact No. 597-645 from 25. 9. 2014-17. 2. 2016 Date and time of contact, Saturday, 15th August 2015, 1744 Whose translators, DeepL Translator, Joseph Darmanin, Stefan Zutt FIGU-Landesgruppe, Australia Date of original translation, Sunday, 27th December 2020 Corrections and improvements made, Joseph Darmanin Contact Persons, Ptaah.
Synopsis. This is the entire contact report. Parts 1, 3, and 5 are authorized but unofficial DeepL preliminary English translations and most probably contains errors.
As contracted with Billy/FIGU.
Please note that all errors and mistakes and so on will continuously be corrected, depending on the available time of the involved persons. Therefore, do not copy-paste and publish this version elsewhere, because any improvement and correction will occur here in this version. Contact Report 625 Translation, Part 1 625th Contact Saturday, 15th August 2015, 1744 hours.
Greetings, Ptaah, dear friend. It is my great pleasure to greet you again after more than 2.5 months and to see that you are well. You are very welcome, my friend.
Here you come, dear friend, and I greet you with great relief and also with great joy. Florina and Jenna have informed me about the health problems you have had, and why you had to have a heart operation, which was due for years, but which you have always delayed against the advice of Eva, the cardiologist, and me. But now the necessary has been done, and I see that everything has turned out and been settled in a good way according to your condition.
You are probably right about delaying, but I think I was right to do so, even though your daughter Simyase has already recommended an operation to me. I had to take medication for my heart problems 53 years ago when acute attacks required it. At that time it was Veldam and then later nitroglycerin just until 12 June, that is, until the time of the operation. In addition, the development of artificial aortic heart valves was not as advanced at that time as it is today. I was also told by the heart surgeon that the lifespan or functional capacity of such heart valves was much shorter than it is today, being 15 to 20 years or even 25 to 30 years. So I think I was right to delay, because in the past such heart operations were much more life-threatening and difficult than they are today. I also told Simyase Quetzal and you, even against your objections and offers of help, because as an earthling I didn't want to have more rights than everyone else, that I would wait with an operation as long as it was possible for me from a life point of view, and that by then medical and surgical technology would have advanced so much that I would have a better chance. The three of you have also confirmed that earthly medical and surgical technology is developing and improving rapidly. But this year I had more and more frequent attacks of dizziness and fainting spells, which is why Eva was so close to me that after 2 admissions to the hospital in winter and after a separate cardiological examination, which revealed the necessity of an operation, I booked myself into the University Hospital in Zurich on Thursday the 11th of June. However, this did not happen because I had such a severe heart attack during the night of the 4th to the 5th of June that Eva put me in the car first thing in the morning and took me to the University Hospital, for which I am very grateful to her. If she hadn't done that and had not had her way, it would probably have been too late and I would not be here anymore, because the severity of the aortic valve calcification had progressed too far, and without stabilization in the University Hospital. Well, it just so happened that the whole thing came faster than expected for me in terms of the necessary operation, which was announced over several months by increasing attacks. Suddenly it became acute, so an operation could no longer be postponed. If I had only gone to the clinic on the 11th of June, there would have been no early stabilization and probably no operation on the 12th of June, so that would have been the end. Of course, they examined me very carefully at the University Hospital and classified me as an emergency, which I also supported. So they kept me and stabilized me, after which I was operated on at 11. Hers on the 12th of June and an artificial aortic heart valve was inserted. Unfortunately, after the operation, due to cardiac arrhythmia, not everything went exactly as planned, and I also had to stay in hospital for a few days longer than planned, which was somehow to be expected due to the emergency operation. The doctors and the surgeon were at first unsure how the operation should be carried out before they made a decision and determined the type of operation. I then had to study a description of the operation and sign forms stating that I agreed to the operation and to any more serious changes to the operation. It was explained that 2% of the operations cause certain complications and 3% cause cardiac arrhythmia, and also 6% of the operations have fatal consequences within the first 30 days, so roughly 1% in 66 does not survive the operation during this time. Well, until last Sunday, and so on the 9th of August, I was not feeling very good after returning home from the university hospital, and so on. More bad news than good, but since last Sunday evening things have been looking up, so I can effectively say that I am finally feeling good again in terms of my health and my heart. So it is not necessary for you to bother about me in this respect, because I can judge very well for myself how I feel physically and consciously, mentally, and can also say what my state of health is and how I am doing all round, just good now.
To say anything more about this is probably inappropriate, because on the one hand I see that you are well, and on the other hand you have always explained your state of health and your entire condition to me so exactly, precisely and clearly, because you have really always judged everything correctly in this respect, that I could only confirm the whole thing in each case if you allowed me to make a diagnosis. I would like to say, however, that I am surprised at your state of health, because after 2 months after the emergency operation on your heart, which was not easy, you're really in an astonishingly satisfactory state of health. In my opinion, this is not self-evident, because even after such operations the convalescence period can usually take many months, as I know from studies which I have carried out in this respect by means of secret observations, clarifications, and diagnosis with various Earth human beings who had to undergo the same heart operation as you. I was able to carry out my studies through our highly developed technical possibilities in 2 earthly clinics which carry out this type of operation for the purpose of implanting an artificial aortic heart valve.
I did not know that. But the doctors at the university hospital also told me that I should recover and not go back to work at full speed straight away.
Thrombus.
Now I have to take special medication so also to protect against thrombosis, and so on, a medication to prevent a blood clot from forming in a vessel. I have to take this until December, and then 2 other medicines for life.
Which will be unavoidable.
I know, yes, and that with us Earthlings long convalescence periods are necessary after such operations. I also know that. Christian also still has problems today, even though it's been almost 2 years since his operation, during which he didn't receive an aortic heart valve but only a stent. And to what you said earlier about my behavior, I was never interested in saying anything other than what I myself could determine about my health and judge from my condition. Although I am not a doctor, my mind, my reason, and my ability to judge and perceive are well enough developed to be able to judge myself and my state of health, as well as what causes me health problems and what I can endure, bear, and achieve. And by what I lack, I mean, of course, only those things in relation to an ailment or disease that I am able to recognize and judge for myself intellectually and knowingly, without having to face a medical diagnosis.
I do not think there is any doubt about that.
Then what is necessary in this regard is said. Then I would like to talk about the articles of the Constitution and bylaws, as well as the other articles that Florina and Jenna took with them the day before yesterday and sent to you for your perusal and evaluation. Concerning my article on environmental degradation, it is important for me to know if you have studied it and if my information is correct or if there are any mistakes.
Environmental destruction as a result of overpopulation. The following article is a summary of prophecies, predictions, and probability calculations discussed in various conversations between the Pleiad and Ptaah and Beam regarding the environmental destruction of planet Earth as a result of degenerate, criminal and irresponsible machinations and behavior by the or of human overpopulation. The detailed data and facts specifically mentioned in the article correspond to the information and calculations of the Pleiad and Ptaah.
The world will not end, but it will change very dramatically, as will also be the case with regard to the whole of humanity itself and its existence. The extent at which these dramatic and drastic changes will become reality depends both on how and to what extent the world's population increases and thus the worldwide overpopulation continues to rise in the future, as well as on the extent at which the impairments, destructions, and annihilations of nature, its fauna and flora, the climate and the planet, caused by the criminal machinations of overpopulation, continue to be irresponsibly pushed forward. At the forefront of the destruction of nature, flora, and fauna is agriculture, as well as commercial nurseries, and so on, but also many human beings who spread millions of tons of chemical toxins into nature and its fauna and flora, as well as onto and into food plants, in order to make them thrive and grow and to protect them from weeds, grubs, and vermin. The incalculable masses of chemical toxins that are deposited in food plants of all kinds and then eaten by human beings cause them to fall ill, waste away, and ultimately die. And the fact that valuable plants, animals, lizards, insects, aquatic life, and birds are also poisoned and wiped out by these chemical toxins is another unforgivable factor that must be blamed on agriculture and commercial nurseries and so on the one hand, but also on the agronomists and chemical propagandists and the chemical users among the people. This is because, on the one hand, as a result of their stupidity or greed for profit, they use chemical toxins without hesitation and introduce them into natural foodstuffs, and thus also into the animals that are kept and slaughtered for the meat needs of human beings, which then naturally enter the human food cycle, and thus endanger the health of human beings and cause damage to their health. On the other hand, it is also agriculture and other businesses that breed and fatten cattle, poultry, and all kinds of animals, whereby these fattening creatures are treated with various antibiotics as a prophylactic measure to prevent disease. The fact that these antibiotics are also deposited in the flesh of the cattle, poultry, and animals, and that they are reabsorbed by human beings when they eat them and create antibiotic resistance in them, so that they can no longer be cured of various diseases or protected from infections and so on, which often results in death, is of no concern at all to the cattle, poultry, and animal breeders. The main thing for them is only greedy financial profit, because from this point of view and way of acting, and thus in this respect they know no responsibility for fellow human beings as well as for nature and its fauna and flora, which they poison and contaminate. And this will also continue for a long time in the future, so that many more extinctions, destructions, and annihilations will occur in nature with regard to flora and fauna, just as many more human beings, young and old of all social classes, will fall ill and die as a result of the irresponsible, profit-hungry, or simply thoughtless, stupid misuse of antibiotics and chemical toxins. Well, those super sleuths who, despite their ignorance and stupidity, want to know everything better or are paid horrendous bribes for their claims of lies are on an intelligence less run track, entangled in untenable lies, or completely brain dead. This is because they believe, lie, or fabricate primitively, stupidly, twisting facts and not understanding that fundamentally and first and foremost the chemical companies and chemical producers would be to blame for everything. Thus, they attribute the blame for the prevailing disaster of all chemical-induced poisoning, destruction, and annihilation of nature and waters, as well as for the extermination of thousands of vital insects, plants, birds, animals, and creatures, and so on, as well as for the poisoning of natural foodstuffs, such as vegetables, berries, herbs, fruits, and all kinds of grain plants sold to the corporations and other producers who manufacture toxic chemical products. However, the fact that all those human beings are irresponsibly and even criminally at the very forefront of culpability, who unhesitatingly use the chemical poison clubs and introduce them into the environment, into the natural foodstuffs, the plants, and the waters, and thus into the whole of nature and its fauna and flora, and thus poison everything, is hardly mentioned at all, if at all. So it is not made clear that first and foremost the users and consumers of chemical weapons are the criminally irresponsible ones who poison everything, also human beings and the whole of nature with all its trimmings, and thereby provoke and produce diseases, epidemics, and even extinction, death, and destruction. First and foremost are agriculture and commercial gardening, but also all those human beings and authorities, and so on, who just as thoughtlessly and irresponsibly spread chemical poisons in their gardens, fields, meadows, and roadsides, railway lines, or in any other way into nature and the environment. So it is not first of all the chemical companies and other producers of chemical poisons that are spread into nature and its fauna and flora and also on natural foodstuffs and so on for the purpose of faster and better growth as well as for protection against insects and frass, but fundamentally the users and consumers of the chemical clubs. The chemical companies and other producers of chemical products, which are spread in nature and the environment, and so on, come in second place precisely because they are only the producers of the chemical substances through the production and sale of which they make billions in financial profits. Above all the chemical poison bombs are mendaciously recommended by agronomists and propagandists and are bought and used by farmers and gardeners, by authorities and companies, and so on, as well as by private individuals, to promote the growth of vegetables, grains, and other plants, and also as protection against insects and pests, whereby it is always financially horrendous profiteering or some other advantage that determines the course of action in this respect. So it is not the chemical companies and chemical producers who are at the forefront of the misuse of chemical means by which everything and anything is poisoned, but the farmers and the agronomists advising them, as well as the commercial nurseries, authorities, companies, and all those of the people who use chemical toxins for plant growth and direct or prophylactic plant protection, usually as a result of recommendations by agronomists, propagandists, and unthinking supporters from the people. And again, the truth is that it is the farmers and gardeners and the people in the first place who use all the chemical poisons propagated to them and apply them to the natural foodstuffs, such as vegetables, herbs, berries, fruit and grain, and poison them with the chemical substances. The fact is that every farmer and gardener, as well as every human being among the people, does not need to be propagandist into using chemical poisons to make the plants grow better and to protect them from insects, and so on. Even if propaganda is carried out, every human being has his own mind, will and a certain amount of reason from which he is able to decide for himself what is correct and wrong and what is irresponsible or responsible. Therefore, no human being is forced by any propaganda to spread any chemical toxins into the environment, into nature and its fauna and flora, because every human being can decide for himself in full responsibility without being influenced. Consequently, everyone is responsible for himself with regard to exercising and bearing responsibility or irresponsibility. Consequently, there is no excuse whatsoever if irresponsibility is acted upon. This applies equally to the use of antibiotics, because every human being who uses such substances is to be called criminal and irresponsible. So also every farmer, and with regard to natural foodstuffs such as vegetables and fruit, and so on, also gardeners who apply poisonous substances, as well as everyone else who treats cattle, poultry, and other living beings with antibiotics and breeds and fatten them for meat production and as food for human beings. So in this respect, too, every human being decides for himself and on his own responsibility or irresponsibility whether or not he wants to use antibiotics and toxins and thus endanger the health of human beings and make them ill and even send them to their death. Basically, then, it is not the producers of the chemical growth and protection agents and antibiotics that are poisonous to human beings, nature, fauna and flora, and so on, not the chemical corporations and chemical producers, just as it is not the propagandists who are primarily to blame for the poisoning of natural foodstuffs, nature and its fauna and flora, and even for their extinction as well as the diseases of human beings. The truth is that it is the unscrupulous users and consumers of all the poisonous chemical substances and antibiotics that are used out of pure greed for profit, be it with regard to the irresponsible criminal application of poisons to natural foodstuffs of all kinds, or with regard to nature and its fauna and flora, or with regard to the feeding of antibiotics to cattle, poultry, and all kinds of animals and creatures whose meat contaminated with poison and antibiotics serves as food for human beings. If the whole thing continues in the way it has since the beginning of modern times from 1844 to the present day, then Earth human beings are threatened with a very evil future. And this is also the case with regard to overpopulation, because if nothing changes for the better in this respect by drastically curbing worldwide overpopulation through a strictly controlled birth stop and a controlled birth regulation, then the world and its humanity will face a very evil future as a result of their globally destructive and destructive as well as irresponsible machinations.
Who are often paid by corporations for false claims, lies and trivializations of the effective truth regarding climate change, and thereby profit financially.
What is threatening in the future and will most probably become reality due to the manifold crass egoism of the human beings of the earth, as well as due to their lack of understanding and irresponsibility, and what can be carried out in addition in a prophetic, predictive and probability calculating form, is additionally the following. Even today, Unteachable so-called experts negate climate change or the associated consequences with erroneous claims that the whole of climatic change is completely natural and normal. To the same sort of people who trivialize the actual facts belong all those know-it-alls and wise slogans from the people who, due to their stupidity, do not recognize reality at its truth and live dreamily in illusions of an intact nature and its fauna and flora, as well as a completely natural climate change and a healthy world, but also a better, good and healthy future. And unfortunately there are far too many of these kind of know-it-alls who walk blindly around the earth and do not perceive the effective reality with regard to all the destruction and devastation caused to the world, its nature, fauna and flora, as well as to all waters, primeval forests and other forests, meadows, seas, floodplains, glaciers, landscapes and the climate and so on by the criminal machinations of massive overpopulation. To this end, stupid speeches are made, such as that in the last 2 years alone there have been several phases of global warming or cooling and that plants would benefit from an increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. Of course, in global terms, the average temperature at the time of the Roman Empire in the Middle Ages was higher than today because there were also higher warm periods then, but this cannot be compared with the consequences of today's climate change. If we go back even 6 to 7 years, then there was also a warm period at that time, which led to the Arctic being largely ice-free. But if we go even further back into the past, then it can be scientifically proven today that at the time of the dinosaurs and all other prehistoric animals, the amount of carbon dioxide was 4 to 6 times higher than it is today, which of course also had an impact on all the genera and species of the plant world, which showed gigantic growth. With climate change and the related global changes, the food and water crisis as well as the natural disasters, major problems of the present and the future must be addressed, because when everything is looked at closely, it becomes clear and obvious how much strain is being put on the environment by overpopulation and urbanization. In particular, all of humanity as well as all of nature and its fauna and flora, as well as the planet itself, are being affected by climate change caused by human fault, with erosion and desertification as blatant consequences of overpopulation machinations wreaking just as much havoc on the entire ecosystem as monocultures and the cultivation of plants that are in demand on the world market. And the fact that the plants still grow locally at all is like a miracle, which only happens through the absolutely consensus and ruthless exploitation of the earth's, soils, natures, forests and waters resources, whereby for this, however, more and more stretches of land are rendered completely barren and lay hopelessly fallow, above all in developing countries, which are mainly exploited and robbed consciencelessly and criminally to the last by in every respect well-off large and billionaire corporations of the rich industrialized countries. This is especially true for the impoverished and sick human beings of the Third World and developing countries who have no chance to defend themselves because the governments of the countries are usually so corrupt that they simply let their own people die in their misery. The increasing environmental pollution, environmental poisoning and environmental destruction caused by the cutting down of virgin forests has become extremely problematic for nature and its fauna and flora and has led to great destruction as well as tremendous climate changes. If the future of the Amazon rainforest is considered, up to 60% will have been irrevocably destroyed by the year 2030 due to the unconscionable and criminal deforestation of the same. If we look at the primeval forests in Asia, it is clear that 3/4 of them have already been hopelessly cleared and destroyed. But the deforestation catastrophe is also spreading in Africa, and on an extremely serious scale, because currently only 8% of the primeval forest is still untouched. The fact is that every year as much primeval forest is destroyed worldwide as 3 times the area of Switzerland, which is 41,285 if the mountain areas are not included.
See Appendix, end of article, area of Switzerland.
This means that around 125,000 of primeval forest are destroyed worldwide every year. Of course, this has devastating consequences for nature and its fauna and flora, but also for the climate and the oxygen content in the atmosphere, which is vital for all life forms on Earth. The fact is that tropical rainforests produce 40% of all oxygen. Despite this, however, the rainforests are being unthinkingly and criminally plundered, destroyed and completely annihilated for the sake of filthy lucre and profit. Every year huge areas of primeval forest fall victim to manning slash and burn agriculture, the timber industry, gas and oil production, but also to the construction of hydroelectric power plants. Many virgin rainforest areas that have been cleared and continue to be cleared are being planted with various plants that can be used to produce biofuels, with more than half of the newly reclaimed land being misused in this way. The destruction of tropical rainforests with timber harvesters and so on alone accounts for about 25% of global CO2 emissions. If we look at the developing country Indonesia, which is the third largest CO2 producer today, the peat fires there currently cause emissions of 700–800 million tons of carbon dioxide. If CO2 emissions are considered in relation to the common deforestation of the tropics as a whole, then between 100 and 130 billion tons of CO2 can be expected to be produced by the year 2100. Calculations show that if sugarcane or oil palms were planted to replace the deforested rainforests, a period of 50 to 120 years would be needed before the CO2 emissions saved by fossil fuels and deforestation could be recouped. If maize or soybeans were planted as a substitute, it would take 400 to 600 years. It is not only the rainforests that are being burned and destroyed, but also large areas of bush and shrub land, steppes and forests, both through lightning strikes and also through the fault of human beings who carelessly, wantonly and irresponsibly start bush fires and forest fires. But more and more often, bush and shrub areas as well as forests are also deliberately burned down for criminal, commercial, speculative reasons in order to create increasingly scarce building land for factories, houses, settlements, sports grounds and roads, and so on, the whole thing being founded in the irresponsible degenerative measures and needs of the overpopulation that is still rampant worldwide. If nature and its fauna and flora are considered, then the very strong decline in biodiversity that has taken place due to the destruction of the environment is to be denounced in a frightening manner. In relation to all the approximately 32 million genera and species of plants and animals, more than two-thirds live in the primeval forests, many of them threatened with extinction or already extinct due to the criminal deforestation and clearing of the rainforests. New natural pathogens also play a very important role in the overall threat and extinction of plants and animals, as does the spread of alien species from other ecosystems, displacing and even eradicating native plant and animal species. In particular, the future will bring with it that in gardening and agriculture, weed species native to the area and also introduced from foreign countries through globalization will become rampant, proliferate and can no longer be controlled with herbicides and thus can no longer be eradicated, consequently letting the fertile land go wild and degenerate into infertility. The reason for this will be found in the fact that weeds of all kinds change in such a way that they become resistant to all herbicides or weed killers and spread in such a way that they displace the valuable food plants and deprive them of the necessary space to thrive and live, which of course has an extremely negative effect on natural food production. Already today, various weed species can no longer be controlled because they have changed so much and adapted to the chemical toxins through the irresponsible worldwide chemical use of herbicides in the course of the last decades that they can no longer be eradicated. And this is already the case worldwide with various weeds, for example with regard to the palma foxtail, Monsanto's palma foxtail, glyphosate pigweed, Roundup-resistant monster plant, new high-tech weed from the orcas and not to be killed, was brought in from South America and is displacing, choking and wiping out all garden and agricultural plants, which is spread catastrophically over square kilometers in various places in the USA. This is also common to many other alien and native weed species that are already herbicide resistant or will be in the future. In Europe, too, there are already a great many plants and animals, all kinds of insects and other creatures introduced through globalization, whereby these, according to precise Plejadian data, are to be comprehensively calculated with a total number of 12 with regard to all genera and species. Since their deliberate introduction or involuntary introduction, many of them have already become so acclimatized that it is impossible to imagine the European ecosystem without them. And this will continue to be the case in the future due to globalization and the associated introduction of plants and all kinds of creatures. If we consider the many foreign plants that have been introduced into Europe, then there is also a great evil in this respect today, such as with regard to the golden rue/goldenrod, the composite genus with around 80 mostly North American species. Perennials with undivided, alternate leaves and golden yellow flower heads, which originates from the USA. The species common goldenrod Solidago gigantea. Solidago canadensis grows up to 1 high in dry forests and bushes and runs wild on wasteland. Also to be mentioned is the Balsamina, Impatiens glandulifera. Herbaceous plant, genus balsamines, mostly found in tropical Africa and Asia. The seeds are ejected from their fruit capsules when touched or when they burst open due to seed ripening. Balsamines. Sinolemptingia, Romicnixton. Furthermore, the wild-grown ragweed, Ambrosia artemisifolia. Greek, immortality/Greek, food of the gods, which originated in North America, is also a plant. Greek mythology, food of the gods, which gives them eternal youth and immortality, which can hardly be stopped today.
As well as other countries. Heracleum manticasianum.
In addition, there are numerous other plants that have been introduced into Europe, such as the Gaian hogweed, which also grows up to 5 meters high and which requires a special description because it is more than just an annoying weed, but must be described as an invasive neophyte as an invading new plant that spreads and leaves no room for other plants. Its seeds fly out and germinate especially often along streams and rivers as well as on fallow land and roadsides, but also find their way into gardens. It settles there on nutrient-rich sites that are not too dry. Each plant produces between 10 and 50 seeds, which can even float. In human beings, it causes severe burns on the body if they come into contact with the sap of the Gaian hogweed. Affected people first feel a burning sensation on the skin and then a swelling that can go as far as the formation and detachment of blisters. Depending on the exposure to sunlight, the most severe manifestation is reached after about 2 days. The sap of the plant contains so-called furanocormorants, which in combination with sunlight lead to second-degree burns. Sunlight thus plays the decisive role in causing the phototoxic reaction. After contact with the aggressive sap of the Gaian hogweed, the main thing is to avoid sunlight. Sun protection should also be continued after the reaction has subsided. The symptoms can be treated on an outpatient basis with painkillers, cortisone cream and colon. The rise of ever more extreme weather conditions also leads to further disasters, as does the loss of fertile land, the immense pollution of the waters by chemicals, human and animal excrement, household waste, industrial waste, plastics of all kinds, antibiotics and artificial fertilizers, and so on. Also the acidification of the oceans and so on, the application of pesticides, herbicides, neonicotinoids and all kinds of other poisons, as well as industrial and heat and fumes and emissions from cars and other combustion engines endanger and destroy biodiversity. Around 50 species of all genera and species of amphibians, plants, animals, insects, reptiles, beetles, aquatic life and other creatures of all kinds together are disappearing every year. And if this continues at this rate, then it is absolutely possible that by the year 2100 half of all genera and species of all living creatures, such as plants, animals and creatures and so on, will be extinct. Expert calculations speak of approx. 30% of amphibians, 24% of mammals and 12% of birds. This also includes marine life, whereby it is calculated that if overfishing is not stopped, no commercial fishing will be possible by the year 2050 at the latest, because the oceans and all waters will be completely fished out. If this actually happens, it means that more than 1.5 billion human beings will be deprived of the only source of protein on which their lives depend. This, in addition to the fact that the entire majority of earthly humanity will also no longer have any possibility of using fish and other marine and aquatic life as food. If we look at environmental pollution in third world, developing, industrialized and newly industrialized countries, we can see that it is growing inexorably due to the increasing extraction of raw materials and rapid industrialization, even though environmental pollution has been reduced over the years in the wet countries. In addition, it is worth mentioning that when such resolutions are passed, the whole thing is not even a drop in the ocean, because during the time until such resolutions are implemented in reality, 10 or 20 years, and so on, the world population grows by another 100 million per year, which means that by the time the resolutions are implemented, they are already very much outdated and the problems are many times greater than when the resolutions were passed. If, in addition to all natural and unnatural deaths, an average of 100 million human beings per year is assumed in accordance with today's global population growth, then the increase in overpopulation for the next 35 years up to the year 2050 will amount to around 3.5 billion more human beings populating and harassing the Earth. If thus in 2015 the earthly human being is in truth to be calculated with a number of more than 8.5 billion, according to exact Plejadian clarifications and contrary to the false calculations and claims of the earthland statisticians who assume only about 7 4 billion in 2015 and believed that in 2050 only 9 billion human beings would populate the Earth. Then in 2050 there will be around 12 billion human beings overpopulating the Earth and, with their degenerate machinations, wreaking much more havoc on all of nature, fauna and flora, on the climate, on the oceans and waters, on the land, on the Earth itself, and on the already very poor moral quality of life of human beings. And this is because the actual evil is not being tackled, and only the symptoms are being combated, because basically the source of all the evil should be tackled, namely the rampant overpopulation, which continues to grow inexorably and is not being stopped by global birth control.
Auto.
To the whole of the worldwide miseries and catastrophes, it must also be said that, among other things, the dismantling of trade barriers promoted by the World Trade Organization has led to many states undermining laws on environmental and consumer protection. Not only nature and its fauna and flora suffer, but also the climate and the entire planet, and of course the human beings, because their health is damaged immensely, whereby air pollution plays a decisive role through which up to 4 million human beings die worldwide every year. In addition, it is also to be deplored that worldwide and per year about 16 million human beings die of diseases caused by the consumption of chemically and above all bacterially contaminated water as well as equally contaminated food. The situation regarding drinking water will become very precarious and paradoxical, because on the one hand, water will become increasingly scarce due to persistent droughts, while on the other hand, heavy rainfall in many places will lead to hundreds of thousands of human beings having to worry about their drinking water because it is poisoned by fertilizers washed in from commercial gardens and agriculture, and so on, and toxic algal blooms will also occur on an enormous scale. Drinking water is poisoned by the many chemical pollutants in the soil and water, especially by chemical fertilizers such as phosphorus and nitrogen, but also by pesticides, herbicides and neonicotinoids used in horticulture, agriculture and all kinds of plantations. Of course, the chemicals also get into the groundwater and thus back into the drinking water cycle. Especially in warm weather, all these chemicals cause an explosive growth of cyanobacteria or algal blooms in the open waters, which are also used as drinking water sources. Visually, this manifests itself as a bluish-green discoloration of the water as well as streaking in a greenish carpet of algae on the water surface. All this bacterial growth poses an acute threat to human beings because the bacteria produce various toxins that naturally poison the water, which, when drunk or also used for brushing teeth or cooking, causes diarrhea, vomit and nausea as well as dangerous damage to the liver and kidneys. Heating and boiling the water increases the concentration of toxins considerably, so that the situation may be even more dangerous than it is when the water is used without heating or boiling. It is also to be deplored that the production of rubbish is increasing immensely and uncontrollably worldwide, especially in the industrialized countries, whereby on the one hand less and less space can be found for open rubbish dumps, which in any case poison and pollute the environment and spread diseases, while on the other hand far too little is done to process the accumulating rubbish of all kinds in a correct and useful way. Processing waste in the correct way means that all that is turned into ashes can be burnt, detoxified and reused in some beneficial way, while all that can be reused is recycled, reprocessed and fed into new production. Instead, however, on the one hand, the entire environment is being polluted by the ever-increasing amount of waste worldwide, because it is simply thrown into the fields, waters, seas and forests by irresponsible citizens, who thus endanger nature, fauna and flora and the entire ecosystem. On the other hand, it is also the authorities and governments as well as waste disposal companies that act criminally and irresponsibly with regard to waste disposal, namely by shipping the accumulating mountains of waste to poor countries, as well as to emerging and developing countries, which themselves have a large amount of waste that they cannot cope with. The fact is that in these countries only a small part of the rubbish is collected, while the enormous rest is simply thrown onto the streets, fields and meadows as well as into local waters and the oceans, polluting and poisoning them in the entire environment. In particular, plastic and other plastic waste is extremely problematic because, depending on the type, it only decomposes completely after 100 to 700 years. This type of waste in particular accumulates in local waters and in the oceans and already forms carpets several square kilometers in size in certain ocean drift current eddies. But that is not all, because in the course of time the plastic and other plastic waste is ground into fine powder by the wave movements of the waters and seas as well as by the light of the sun and thus gets into the food of the fish and other aquatic beings on the one hand, and on the other hand also into the food chain of the human beings who eat fish and other aquatic beings. It is also to be said that environmental pollution of all kinds is not only causing the death zones in the waters, on the land, and in the oceans to progress extremely rapidly, but also the poisoning and destruction of fertile ecological areas, which are of extremely great importance for biodiversity. Such death zones caused by enormous environmental pollution and overfertilization of agricultural land with nitrates and phosphates, and so on, currently cover more than 200 square kilometers worldwide, and this in addition to the fact that these fertilizers are washed into streams, rivers, lakes, and seas and cause enormous damage to them by creating huge algal carpets, which impair and even kill aquatic fauna and flora. Plants that have died in the water, as well as aquatic animals and so on, need bacteria to decompose, which require so much oxygen for their own existence that it is no longer sufficient for other aquatic life and aquatic plants, so that neither fish nor crayfish and mussels or other aquatic life can continue to exist, let alone natural aquatic plants except for certain destructive algae. It is also to be said, however, that these death zones appear especially in warm and hot seasons, such as spring, summer, and autumn, because as a rule at these times the waters are not whipped up by storms, which normally ensure that the waters are saturated with much more oxygen than is the case in storm-free periods. Besides the catastrophic pollution and destruction of the environment by earthly humanity itself, as a result of all the irresponsible machinations by the excesses of overpopulation, the earth and all life is being affected by climate change, which alone makes the future of humanity look very bleak. And as I said, earthly mankind itself is to blame for this, because CO2 emissions have increased immeasurably due to the emission of carbon dioxide caused by all kinds of exhaust-emitting machines, forestry, trade, heating, industry, coal and other emission-generating power plants, as well as agriculture, billions of private households, car, diesel, train, aeroplane and ship traffic, as well as senseless and irresponsible motorsports, and so on. These have caused climate change along with various other factors that damage nature, its fauna and flora, and the health of human beings. And the fact is that these CO2 emissions are constantly increasing in relation to the growth of the Earth's population, much more than they correspond to the stupid and false forecasts calculated by would-be experts who are always completely wrong with their stupid claims because they do not take into account the constantly growing overpopulation, which amounts to around 100 million per year, in their crazy calculations. As a result, there is also no radical countermeasure adapted to the circumstances, which can only be based on curbing the earthly population growth, precisely in the form of a globally effective and state-controlled birth control. And since this is not happening, CO2 emissions will continue to increase drastically and probably double within the next 15 years, which will inevitably lead to more and more frequent climatically induced natural disasters and cause immense destruction, both to nature itself and to human achievements. And it will also be inevitable that countless human lives will be lost, just as it will be inevitable that, as mentioned above, the emission of carbon dioxide will become more and more prevalent, precisely because the increasing energy consumption will rise immeasurably, because, according to the population growth, more and more human beings will need more and more energy. Of course, this will not only be the case in the industrialized countries, but also in the overpopulated emerging countries of China and India, which together have a population of almost or around 3 billion. And if the economic demand for energy in these countries is also taken into account, then this results in an enormous mess. And the toxic and climate-destroying emissions from coal and oil-fired power stations for electricity generation, as well as the production of aluminum, glass, steel, and cement, and so on, can no longer be justified, nor can the production of all the goods needed by the entire earthly human race. In this respect, too, carbon dioxide is being emitted on an enormous scale, not only in the newly industrialized countries, but also in the industrialized countries, because in both the richer and the poorer countries, the ever uncontrollably growing overpopulation is increasing, and with the consumption. And if we look at all the emerging and developing countries, we can see that they have a lot of catching up to do with the industrialized countries, because they do not want to lag behind the rich countries in any form of development and therefore also justify growing consumer spending, precisely because they are clamoring for the same expensive standard of living that prevails in the rich industrialized countries. So it will be that in the coming time more and more passenger cars will also increase CO2 emissions, as will pollution and the destruction of nature and its fauna and flora, in relation to the increase in overpopulation. In the coming period, therefore, CO2 emissions will increase very dramatically, in line with continued rampant overpopulation. And since the oceans are already largely saturated with CO2, they will absorb less of it. At present, it is still the case that of every ton of CO2 released by mankind, a little more than half enters the atmosphere, while the rest is taken up and absorbed by the world's oceans. However, the waters, and so on the oceans and also the land waters, are already so saturated with dissolved CO2 that they can absorb less and less carbon dioxide, which means that the atmosphere is becoming more and more polluted and overloaded and harmful to the health of all life forms. Climate change is doing its part, because as the surface waters of waters and oceans become warmer and warmer, the water circulation slows down, so that the surface water sinks less and less into the depths. As a result, carbon dioxide is no longer transported into the depths and nutrient-rich water can also no longer rise. This, of course, means that the phytoplankton receives less nourishment, which has very negative consequences for the oxygen production of the world's oceans as well as for the fish stocks and other aquatic life, for whose food chain the plankton is of great and fundamental importance. In addition to carbon dioxide, mankind on Earth also produces other gases, such as methane and nitrous oxide, which pollute and poison the atmosphere and of course also contribute to global warming.
Troposphere.
Of course, there are also the aerosols, especially the smallest soot particles, which settle in the lowest layer of the atmosphere and affect the climate. A large part of the energy produced by human beings also has a very harmful effect on the atmosphere and the climate as waste heat, because only a very small part of it radiates into space, so that most of the waste heat remains in the immediate atmospheric environment and has a far-reaching harmful effect and also rapidly promotes climate change, which of course does not proceed slowly and steadily, but rather is progressing faster and faster due to feedbacks. The whole thing also leads, among other things, to higher temperatures that cause more water to evaporate inexorably in the Amazon, for example, than would normally be the case. This factor, of course, inevitably leads to the rainforest also suffering and withering away, which in turn has the consequence that carbon dioxide is also released as a result, and so on, not only through the clearing of virgin forest, through the decay and decomposition of the withered trees and plants. Another consequence is the drying out of the soil, trees and plants, which leads to fires caused by any natural or human being-induced factors, which in turn produce enormous masses of CO2. In addition, the rise in CO2 is also accelerating in other ways, namely because global warming is causing the permafrost rocks of the mountains and the permafrost soils to thaw over wide areas, with more than 1.6 trillion tons of carbon dioxide stored in the permafrost soils alone. Since the beginning of industrialization, Earth human beings have released just 110 billion tons. In addition to CO2, enormous amounts of methane gas are bound in the permafrost, which has an even worse effect on the climate than CO2, if it is understood that this climate gas is about 30 times more effective than carbon dioxide. Further, methane is also bound in enormous quantities in frozen sediments at the bottom of the world's oceans, from where it is released by terrestrial movements and heat, and so on, and enters the atmosphere. If it comes to the point where this methane gas thaws as a result of the warming of the seawater, then this will lead to a further drastic change in the average world temperature, increasing it by up to 7 or 8 degrees Celsius. But this is not enough, because very large quantities of methane are also produced by many millions of farm animals, cows, cattle, pigs, and poultry, and so on, which serve as slaughter animals for meat production, and so on, to feed humanity and its domestic animals with meat, and whose numbers are constantly increasing due to the growing demand for meat. If at present earthly mankind, excluding domestic animals, consumes about 360 million tons of meat products annually, this figure is expected to rise to about 530 million tons by the year 2050. The indisputable fact is that carbon dioxide emissions are growing inexorably as a result of the rapidly increasing overpopulation, due to various overpopulation-related causes, such as the increasing use of motor vehicles of all kinds, including cars, ships, aeroplanes, and other means of transport. But also the increasing use of all kinds of working machines, which emit huge amounts of CO2, as well as countless motorized sports vehicles produce huge amounts of carbon dioxide, while millions of animals, poultry, and livestock produce gigantic amounts of methane for meat production. And this is not only ongoing today, but also in the future. Effectively, the whole thing has been going on for many decades, ever since the beginning of the inexorably increase in overpopulation and its degenerations and criminal machinations in connection with chemistry, the irresponsible exploitation and poisoning as well as destruction of many bodies of water, the wars, the resource robbery of every kind, the development of technology, environmental poisoning, environmental destruction as well as destruction of nature and its fauna and flora and so on is an inevitable consequence of all this, which goes into the thousands and cannot all be listed. The climate has also been devastatingly affected by the degenerated, criminal and even criminal machinations, which inevitably arose and still arise from overpopulation. Consequently, the climate change, which as a worldwide effect now brings natural disasters upon natural disasters. This causes tremendous changes in nature and its fauna and flora, which transform the entire ecosystem and cause unimaginable destruction and devastation. Furthermore, catastrophic effects are also increasingly appearing in the existence of human beings themselves, especially in the form of steadily rising unemployment, hatred of asylum seekers, foreigners, people, neighbors, and religion, as well as energy shortages, refugee flows, famines, new diseases and epidemics, water and living space shortages, and growing organized crime and criminality. Among human beings, indifference is becoming more and more blatant, as is misery, enmity, and ill will, while human lives are accorded less and less respect, attention, dignity, and value. Consequently, more and more human beings are killing themselves as a result of weariness and cowardice, and more human beings are being murdered or harassed out of fear, jealousy, hatred, greed for power or money, quarrels, and psychopathic paranoid tendencies and degenerations. In this way, family dramas and fatal family tragedies as well as suicides will also increase, as will murderous tendencies of psychopathic paranoid jealous people, haters, vindictive people, domineering people, sectarians, and other perpetrators. Many things will also degenerate to such an extent that more and more mass murders will occur and bring a great deal of suffering to human beings. But this is not enough, because in the future there will be more and more vicious quarrels, killings, wars, acts of terrorism and civil wars, which will be carried out by the military, state powers, terrorist organizations of all kinds, such as the homogeneous Islamist State with its constantly emerging criminal offshoots in various states against which those responsible in the military and states will only take insufficient and lax action. And if one of these groups is fought and destroyed, then two new murderous offshoots emerge in its place, as with the Lernaean Hydra, which rage, murder, destroy, and annihilate in the worst form. Also to be mentioned are wars and acts of terror, which are triggered by dictators, domineering people, politicians, and religious and sectarian fanatics, as well as due to shortages of medicines and food and water. But also the vicious racial hatred of all forms will become blatantly and increasingly widespread, especially promoted by the ever more rampant refugee system from various dictatorial and misanthropic countries of refuge. Sheer racial terror and racial wars will be feared by vicious racist hate groups and racist organizations in a very strong and increased form than is still the case today in 2015. And in this respect there will be private groups as well as new and similarly oriented organizations, such as in the form of the Neo-Nazis, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Aryan Nation, and so on, which have existed since the 20th century in Europe, Russia, and the USA, as well as in various other countries, and which act and rage just as viciously and even murderously as the Ku Klux Klan, which has been responsible for countless racial murders in the USA since the 19th century. Destruction of human achievements will also occur to an increasing extent in the future, through the degeneracy, viciousness, and wantonness of human beings themselves, as well as through increasing natural disasters. Also hatred, jealousy, and indifference, as well as a lack of relationships, will spread more and more among human beings as a whole, just as the value of human lives will be disregarded more and more, and consequently life and limb will be unhesitatingly, viciously, and wantonly harassed and murdered. Greed, vice, and addictions of all kinds will also increase, as will murder and manslaughter, even in families, schools, and groups, whereby religious, fanatical sectarianism and psychopathic paranoid degenerations will be just as fundamental forms as thought-feeling psychemical disorders and brainwashing factors and alienation from reality as well as unconscientiousness and so on. Well, the indisputable fact is, even if this is still denied today by man-know-it-alls and experts as well as by irresponsible scientists and so on, who are paid for this by unscrupulous corporations, that the emissions of carbon dioxide that have taken place so far and that continue to increase enormously are to blame for the global rise in temperature, which may amount to 6 or even 8 degrees by the year 2100, depending on the case. It is also a fact that tropical cyclones increase by up to 35% with each degree of atmospheric heating. But that is not all, because the Arctic and Antarctic will also be affected by the rise in temperature, as the thickness of their ice sheets will decrease as a result of melting, as is also the case with all mountain glaciers throughout the Earth. If global warming continues at the same rate as it has up to now, precisely because of the degenerations in all respects that appear as consequences of overpopulation, then the Arctic may be ice-free in summer in as little as 25 years. And if we consider that the Arctic's ice surface was once up to 7 million square kilometers, but is now only around 3 million square kilometers, then the whole thing offers a bleak picture of the future, which also says that global warming will only increase as a result because the fact is that the smaller the ice surface, the less sunlight is reflected. Another factor in climate change and ice melt is also that sea levels are rising, currently by about 4.5 per year. So it is easy to calculate that by the year 2100 the rise in sea level must already be measured in meters. According to calculations, the melting of inland ice should cause about 45% of the rise in sea levels, while about 55% should be caused by the rise in temperature and the associated expansion of seawater. With regard to the seas, it is also to be said that the coastal countries on the North Sea will have to prepare for higher storm surges, as these will be up to more than 150 meters higher than before by the end of the 21st century. A rise in sea level of 55-60 Milan will destroy valuable habitats such as alluvial forests, shallow water zones and salt marshes. A 1-meter rise in sea level on the North and Baltic Seas will submerge some 15 square kilometers of coastline and hinterland, with much of the land below the waterline inhabited and farmed by some 4 million human beings at present. But there is another looming scenario for Europe, namely that the warming of the atmosphere may cause a collapse of the Gulf Stream and a new ice age to break over Europe, which is not yet considered likely but may have to be taken into account. Climate change is also causing more and more violent geological changes on planet Earth itself, such as landslides and debris flows due to the thawing of permafrost and rainstorms on the Earth's surface and on the sea. Cracks in the Earth's mantle and consequently major shifts in the Earth's mantle are occurring, in addition to which ever more gigantic primordial hurricanes and tsunamis are breaking over the Earth, causing catastrophic destruction in nature and to human buildings of all kinds and also costing many thousands and thousands of human lives. The traditional laws of nature will come apart at the seams and change drastically in new forms, leading to new geological as well as natural changes to which humanity will inevitably have to adapt, or, if it does not, perish. The whole process of adapting also means that a worldwide birth stop and, of course, a global birth control will have to take place, but also that all human machinations of any kind that destroy nature, fauna, flora, and the climate, as well as all other degenerated human machinations worldwide, will have to come to an end once and for all. But there is another scenario, namely that by the year 2100 the globally increased temperature will lead to severe droughts, and also the Amazon rainforest will be affected and up to 75% destroyed, if the whole destruction continues as it is caused by the degenerate machinations of overpopulation. However, it is already clear that early humanity and its governments and all those responsible will not take any measures to stop the growth of the world's population, as would be necessary through an appropriate birth stop and radical birth control in a worldwide form. But this will also be the case with regard to the destruction of the Amazon region, where in the best-case scenario the destroyed rainforest areas will become grass and shrub savannas, or lifeless wasteland. But that is not all, because southern Europe and the southwest of the USA, as well as southwest Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and large parts of Australia, could also be subject to destructive droughts in the future, which would then have a very adverse effect on the regional climate. Inevitably, more and more bush areas would emerge, far exceeding anything known so far. And the fact that these new dry periods will also lead to huge crop losses everywhere is also unavoidable. But elsewhere, the dangers of unusually huge floods will also increase, for example in West and South America, as well as in New Zealand, in Northern Australia and in Eastern China, and so on, while in temperate regions such as Northern Europe, Canada, and South America, there will be more arable land as a result of climate change, which will naturally lead to higher crop yields, which is also related to the fact that various food and wool plants grow better and faster with higher CO2 levels. But it will also result in other foreign animals, birds, and all kinds of foreign land and water creatures from foreign countries acclimatizing and settling, not only through introduction as a result of criminal globalization, but also through climate-induced direct immigration. At present, as well as in the future, climate change is causing the greatest damage and destruction in poor countries, although industrialized countries will not be spared either. Overall and globally, the damage caused by climate change, its effects and natural disasters will run into billions of Swiss francs. If we only think of the rise in the global sea level, which, if it rises by only half a meter, will threaten around 140 million coastal cities, then we can really calculate that enormous human achievements and assets will be destroyed by the rising waters, which must also be calculated as damage values in the billions of Swiss francs. But the expected scenario could go so far that even entire states could disappear from the Earth's surface, such as the approximately 1-200 islands of the Maldives, because their highest elevation is only just 240 m above sea level. If the sea level rises by even half a meter, this will mean, and this is very likely to happen, that a large part of the islands will become uninhabitable. It should also be said that global warming is causing seawater to penetrate further and further into the mainland, both into the soil that is cultivated for food crops and into the vital groundwater that serves the human beings as drinking water and irrigation water for the fields. The greatest sufferers from the effects of climate change are effectively, as mentioned, the poor countries and their human beings, even though they have only contributed a small part to global warming as a whole, which will also continue to be the case. And as far as the resources are concerned, which are plundered in these countries by corporations of the industrialized countries, the human beings of these poor countries are hardly involved in this, if at all, if they have any resources at all in their country. But this is not enough, because the consequences of climate change alone are creating problems in poor countries that can no longer be overcome. If in this regard the coming droughts are mentioned, which will inevitably come, then the barren fields will dry up and become even more completely infertile. Consequently, as mentioned, famines will also increase. In addition, the sources of water will dry up due to the drought, whereby the human beings as well as nature and its fauna and flora will be confronted with such a lack of water that death will become more and more widespread among the human beings as well as in the fauna and flora. Water bodies will also suffer from the drought and, of course, shipping will suffer from their sinking, as will hydroelectric power plants, because far more than half of the water taken from nature is consumed in the energy industry, especially with regard to nuclear power plants, which need river water to cool their facilities. Thus, in the future, if these power plants are not shut down early for reasons of common sense, this will have to be done when the lack of water no longer allows water to be wasted for such power plants. In contrast to this, there is at the same time the increasing energy consumption for air conditioning and the daily energy consumption for households, agriculture, and industry, in relation to the unchecked and ever more rapidly increasing overpopulation. Furthermore, the coming heat and drought will lead to harvest losses in regional parts of Europe, while in other regions, however, agriculture can expect good and even increasing yields because new types of grain are being bred that require very little moisture and will also be more resistant to heat than today's varieties. In parts of Europe, the heat will increasingly exceed 40 degrees Celsius and cause enormous problems for human beings. As far as forests are concerned, increasing global warming will cause spruce trees to die, because this tree species tends to require a cooler climate. As a result, tree species such as maple, beech, oak, and southern tree species, which are more resistant to heat and drought, will increasingly replace the northern conifers. So a large part of the native trees will disappear in the whole of Earth because of climate change, although, as I said, more and more species from southern Europe and other regions of Earth will gain a foothold in Europe, as will also be the case with animals, insects, birds, aquatic life, and all kinds of creatures. In particular, those genera and species that were previously only spring, summer, and autumn visitors will now settle in Central and Northern Europe for good and remain all year round. So it is also clear that winters throughout Europe will be much milder and wetter than today. This will naturally also reduce the need for heating everywhere, as will the periods of frost and cold. Nevertheless, heavy storms and torrential rain will occur in winter, with much flooding, mudslides and inundations causing havoc and great destruction, as well as bringing much suffering, distress and misery to human beings. Frost and snow will steadily diminish and thus decrease considerably due to climate change, estimated down to lower altitudes below 900 meters. Of course, this will also put a strain on winter sports facility operators and cause them to go bankrupt because the mountain areas will become snow-free. Unreasonably, ski slopes are first maintained with artificial snow, which of course again requires enormous amounts of energy as well as water, until these two can no longer be applied and their use must ultimately be abandoned or banned. With regard to Central and Northern Europe, the effects of climate change will be relatively minor in terms of drought catastrophes, which will cause tremendous changes in those countries that will be affected by them and where there will also be a tremendous lack of water. Nevertheless, the whole of Europe will also suffer from droughts and water shortages, but there will also be an increase in natural storms and severe flood, which will cause great disasters, damage and destruction and cost many human lives. Of course, the annual mean temperature will also rise in the long term, with up to 4 or even 7 degrees to be expected by the year 2100, depending on how further destruction of nature, its fauna and flora, and climate change develop as a result of the continued enormous growth and degenerative measures of overpopulation. What is certain, however, is that the summers will become hotter and drier all over Europe, and consequently the summer temperatures will rise to 30 degrees or more, even in the shade. This means that the human beings living in Central and Northern Europe, who are not used to such high temperatures, will then experience difficulties in living because ozone and smoke will cause dangerous damage to the bronchial tubes and lungs, as well as increasing death rates from heat exhaustion or heart attacks. At this coming time, an increase in mortality rates of up to 6% per additional degree of heat must be expected in Europe as a result of increasing global warming, precisely because Central and Northern Europeans are not used to high heat. However, this Europe-wide temperature increase, which is accompanied by a shift in climate zones, will also bring new diseases and epidemics, especially those from southern countries, with malaria, along with other tropical diseases and also serious epidemics at the forefront.
Meningoencephalitis.
But not only the summers of the future, but also the spring and autumn seasons will take their toll in terms of damage to the health of Europeans, such as tick bites in the early summer season, causing Lyme disease and meningitis. Skin cancer will also reap rich harvests as a result of the ever more aggressive solar radiation, not only in summer, but also in spring and autumn. But due to the climatic changes, chemical toxins applied to natural foodstuffs will also cause hitherto unknown changes, whereby human beings will become increasingly ill with allergies and gastrointestinal disorders. If we look at the glaciers in more detail, we can say that the future melting of the Himalayan glaciers alone will be a catastrophe for more than 1.5 billion human beings, because the lack of water will claim its victims with terrible consequences. In India alone, when the great droughts come, the continued existence of meager agriculture will become a huge problem, directly affecting about 65–75% of the population. But also in northern China, as in other countries, areas of land will wither and become desolate, or otherwise desert-like areas will continue to spread. In the future, droughts, but also destructive floods and all kinds of storms and earthquakes will drive many African, Central Asian and Southeast Asian countries into state collapse. And just as the worldwide refugee system has already spread on a large scale, as was predicted in the 1950s and even later, the great migrations and exodus of peoples will only begin correctly. While today the number of refugees per year is still manageable for the countries taking them in 35–50 years there will be about 300–350 million refugees who will leave their homeland as a result of climate change and its catastrophic consequences, and also as a result of negative and difficult political, military, religious and terrorist unrest and machinations, and seek new refuge in foreign countries all over the world, whereby Europe in particular, as is already the case today, will be favored. And this is the case with all the masses of refugees coming from all over the world, but especially from Africa and Arabia, and landing on Italian and Greek islands or on the mainland in large soul cellars and ramshackle wooden and rubber boats, if they do not capsize first, fall into the sea, or are thrown in by the smugglers and drown. So the longer and the more, and already from the present time onwards, the refugee flows will become ever more enormous and extensive as well as uncontrollable, not only from the continent of Africa, but also from the Balkan and Eastern states, from various states in South America as well as from Asia and the Near and Far East. As a result, the authorities, politicians, aid organizations, surveillance and security forces of the countries into which the refugees are entering or migrating are no longer able to cope with the resultant problems. As a result, refugee camps will be built from demolished houses, army buildings, barracks, containers, tent cities and world camps, and so on, where untenable and miserable hygienic conditions will prevail, as well as attacks and quarrels with nasty consequences among the refugees of different states, religions, sects and social classes crammed together in camps. Crime, disease, epidemics, murder and manslaughter are also spreading inexorably, and an inadequate supply of food and drink and water will also contribute greatly to all the evils that will arise. So even in the refugee camps there will soon be a lack of food and water, and jealousy, hatred, quarrels and fights will arise among the refugees themselves, which will also cause injuries and possibly deaths. The longer, the more a real refugee chaos in various forms will arise, as also for all state security organs, such as supervisory, guard, police and customs officials, unmanageable control, regulation and surveillance conditions and other problems will appear at the national borders and in the countries themselves. In addition, in the countries of refuge, the flow of refugees, mostly economic migrants entering Europe in particular, but also other countries, is causing more and more serious problems among the national populations, their authorities, governments, politicians and political parties with regard to contradictory, false humanist views and opinions in favor of admitting or not admitting or accepting or rejecting, as well as the treatment, rights and deportation of the steadily increasing number of refugees. What is already happening today through the refugee system, and what will inexorably increase in the future, is a mixing of the world's population that can no longer be stopped because the causes that have already been set, the refugee flows, are not being stopped for false humanitarian reasons. Therefore, an unstoppable and worldwide mixture of races and peoples will be just as unavoidable as also the emergence of a new mixed-race humanity, as well as a mixture of religions and their sects, which will also give rise to multiple enmities and hatreds. Through climate change, the whole thing will become a consequence in this way, but the whole world will be affected by it because the change in climate will steadily increase the number of weak and fragile states from which streams of refugees will result. So, of course, the further consequence will be that serious distribution conflicts will arise in all refugee-hosting countries, and on an exuberant scale that dwarfs anything that is already the case in Europe today, as the EU dictatorship dictates to its member states how many refugees they must accept. Conclusion, reason, and rationality must be clearly demanded and expressed, as well as that all nations of the world must in future limit all kinds of emissions just as drastically worldwide as they do the overexploitation of resources. Furthermore, the use of chemicals in nature and its fauna and flora, and thus all chemical and waste-related environmental pollution, environmental poisoning and environmental destruction must be banned and stopped immediately, just as the rapidly increasing overpopulation must be stopped by introducing and enforcing a worldwide and state-controlled and effective birth regulation very quickly. Only in this way can the comprehensive human tragedy still be mitigated, which is looming threateningly in the earth human beings' destiny sky and is already bringing drastic and malignant negative as well as catastrophic and destructive consequences worldwide. Not only all the dirt in the air is changing the climate, but also all the consequences of human degenerations and destructions in relation to nature, its fauna and flora and the climate. The whole of today's natural disasters is an urgent warning of the consequences of climate change. If this is not counteracted very quickly, the Earth will ultimately no longer be able to meet even the most necessary needs of humanity, as a result of which the ever-increasing demand for energy, food and water can no longer be met. If nothing is done to the best of our ability, the whole of all the degenerate machinations brought about by overpopulation will lead to an inevitable, all-encompassing human tragedy. Therefore, all nations of the world are called upon to seize the only small chance they still have to avoid this tragedy. This, however, requires first and foremost that a controlled worldwide birth stop is achieved and a worldwide birth control is introduced, so that overpopulation is quickly curtailed and nature and its fauna and flora as well as the climate can recover from all the destruction caused by the degenerate machinations of overpopulation. The time has long since passed when lax, idiotic, useless and unhelpful international climate protection agreements can still be adopted, for what is needed now is understanding and reason and decisive, drastic, clear, useful and valuable action in order to ultimately prevent the earth human being tragedy that threatens us in the future. Appendix, Area of Switzerland. If the total areas of all mountains and hills in Switzerland are added to the base area measure, then the total area of Switzerland comprises over 80,000. The area of Switzerland, as was / taught in school, is 41,285. However, this is wrong if only the simple base area is calculated without the total areas of all mountains and hills. Switzerland is at least twice as large, more than 80,000, if the total surface area and thus also the areas of steep faces, rocks, slopes, and so on of the mountains and hills are calculated.
Menschentechnik-Wissenschaft.
This is also proven by the latest measurements and calculations with very precise head models and fast computers, as SwissTopo has recalculated the true surface of Switzerland from down to the last detail. So the 41,285 would only be correct if all the mountains and hills in Switzerland were completely flat. 21st July 2015, 22:39 Billy.
Contact Report 625 Translation. Part 2 Important note: this is an official and authorized translation of a FIGU publication. Translator, Stefan Zutt. Date of original translation, Wednesday, 31st August 2016.
I have of course accurately noted and carefully studied this article, as well as the others. The data in your article, environmental destruction as a result of overpopulation, match with the rightness. You can therefore publish it in a bulletin, as I assume that this is what you want to do. You should, however, not consider the Sitzung for this purpose, because it being of another character than the bulletins and special bulletins, that's why it is not suitable for such articles. I want in that respect further on to say that this paperwork is of significance and importance. That's why us from the committee, to which I have submitted the article, express the desire that it gets as quickly as possible issued on the internet and in a way spread worldwide. It should also as quickly as feasible get translated into other languages, and as translation too published on the internet, even though all other earthly languages but German are very poor in expression and deficient. But the aim of it all can also in these inadequate languages be well understood and comprehended.
That surprises me, as we were supposed to no longer translate anything into English or other languages. That was your decision in the committee.
You should indeed not do that, or more precisely the members of the core group should no longer deal with such work. What other persons, also individuals, or fight groups in other countries are doing in respect to translations into other languages, that is outside the remit of the core group members at the parent center. That is also to say that the FIGU groups of other countries should strive to translate this article as well as all other feasible articles along with the 5 and the 4 booklets into their national languages, and to put them into the internet, plus spread them otherwise. It would further on be important for it to reach governing persons and the Pope for their inspection and study. It should also be made available at the information booths, and further on be disseminated by distribution actions.
This would require creating a 5 booklet from it.
That is the wish of our committee too.
That being the case, we will strive for it. But what about us in the FIGU Parent Center receiving those translations, as you have mentioned them, from other persons or FIGU groups for publication on the net?
The rule should be that in case a parent center page in corresponding language exists, those translations may very well be accepted and published in the respective language section on the internet. Otherwise, translations created by the respective persons and FIGU groups should be published on own internet pages. Likewise should all articles and so on translated into other languages be dealt with, when decontrolled as end products by the FIGU Parent Center. On that we have today also taken decisions. We have thus reached a verdict that apart from books, all brochures, booklets and thus also articles and so on should be decontrolled extensively for translation. Consequently, only works and books required as an authorization for translation into foreign languages. The justification for our respective advice is the following. We have noted that already since years worldwide all FIGU articles, FIGU brochures and other FIGU booklets existing on the internet or disseminated in written form are translated into various languages and brought in circulation without acquiring oral or written permission. The whole matter has that way evolved in a manner that it can by no means be overseen anymore and thus also no longer controlled. Would one therefore stick to granting of permissions, it would only become hindering, counterproductive and irrational as well as impairing with regard to the internal and external activity.
Very nice. It is thus no longer necessary to obtain special permits for it from us in the FIGU Parent Center. That saves again work and makes several things easier. On that I am thinking that in contrast to the advantages also disadvantages will again evolve this by way of distortions caused by translations in the manner described by you.
That will of course be so, because certain words, synonyms and descriptions and so on, as existing in the German language, can in no way be translated into other languages or otherwise expressed. However, that can unfortunately not be avoided, but on the other hand such translations ensure that the values of the teaching get disseminated worldwide and bear their fruit.
Thus obtaining of a translation permit applies only to books for which the obligation exists that during the publishing of a book translated into a foreign language the original German text has mandatorily to be added.
That corresponds to the relevant provisions, which do not apply in relation to articles and booklets with respect to translations into other languages.
Then the whole thing is clear. However, what about the articles of statutes and bylaws which we have been working on for months and that urgently need to be cleared up? I had also given the two girls those articles as copies so you and Quetzal as well as the committee would be able to decide about it and reach an assessment.
Contact Report 625 Translation. Part 3 Important note: this is an unofficial but authorized translation of a FIGU publication. Translator, DeepL Translator.
To this end, we met in the panel a few hours ago and decided on this. To that end, it is now necessary for me to show you on the pages the necessary changes or additions that you are to put in.
Of course. Here I have the originals now, if you will explain to me.
Take note of everything as I explain it to you. Then I will start with Article 39. That is all, and now what comes up with Article 11 is the following.
Then that is all?
Correct. And now, as for the reader's question regarding bees, hornets, bumblebees and wasps, the answer to which you also handed over to Flora and Jenna, and which they also sent to me because I am also interested in it, you have given a very good answer to that.
Question: what is it about bee, bumblebee and wasp stings that are very dangerous to human beings and animals, as well as that 3 hornet stings kill a human being and 7 hornet stings kill a horse, and that Asian killer hornets are supposed to wipe out honeybees? Mr. Switzerland.
Answer: first of all, it is to be said that many human beings are not aware of the differences between bees, hornets, bumblebees and wasps. Therefore, the following will briefly explain the differences, whereby please note that the description should not be understood as a scientific treatise with a claim to completeness, but rather as a colloquial description in relation to the insects mentioned. In the presence of bees, hornets, bumblebees and wasps, calmness should be maintained in any case, as well as hectic movements should be avoided. This also applies in particular to bumblebees, which, although also equipped with a stinger, are the most peaceful of the sting-armed insects. Wasps are often found at dining tables, but not bees or bumblebees. Especially sweet foods like cake or jam, but also meat dishes and drinks attract wasps. Bees and bumblebees are not attracted at all, although honey is an exception. It should be noted that if wasps make an appearance while eating and may feast on the food, it should not be accidentally put in the mouth with the food, as this can lead to extremely unpleasant complications, reactions, and pain if a wasp sting occurs in the mouth area. Wasps can be chased away, but this should not necessarily be recommended, because wasps become aggressive when they are waved around and chased away. Shooing away bees and hornets should also be avoided, because they also feel provoked by such action, become aggressive and can sting. And with regard to stinging, there is an essential difference between the bees and the wasp species, to which the hornet also belongs. Bees die when they have stung a human being. This is in contrast to hornets and other wasp species, which survive a sting in human skin without any consequences. However, bees die because their sting is equipped with a barb that ensures that the sting gets stuck in the human skin when the bee stings. The bee cannot retract the stinger after the sting, so it is torn out of the abdomen together with the venom sac, which ultimately leads to the death of the bee. What is certain, however, is that the death of a single bee is of no consequence, because the survival of the colony takes precedence over the individual bee's life. If you are stung by a bee, a hornet, or another wasp species, you should check for allergic reactions and, if in doubt, consult a doctor. If, for any plausible and logical reason, bee, hornet or other wasp nests have to be removed, it must always be remembered that these are nests of very beneficial insects that should not be destroyed, or only in extreme emergencies. Thus, in the case of nest removal, relocation should always be considered, but not destruction and annihilation, because nest destruction should only be carried out if there is a very urgent emergency due to danger to human beings and a nest cannot be removed and, moreover, no protective measure can be implemented. It is very important that a sufficient distance is chosen for relocation, because the insects often fly several kilometers back to their original nest. As a rule, the removal or relocation should not be carried out by laymen, but by an experienced specialist, whereby the fire brigade is often predestined for such actions. If the bee, hornet or wasp nest does not pose a danger, it is also possible to simply wait until the insects die in autumn. Consequently, the paper-like nests, which are only ever inhabited for 1 year, then remain empty. The fact is that it corresponds to an old-fashioned fear and extremely stupid know-it-all attitude and fairy tale that 3 hornet stings would kill a human being and 7 hornet stings would kill a horse.
Vespa velutina.
Also, that the alleged killer hornets brought to France from Asia as a result of globalization, which will also slowly spread throughout Europe, threaten and exterminate honeybees is truthfully based on absolute nonsense and an irresponsible newspaper sensationalist fairy tale. These untruths and truth-devouring assertions and factual slander through stupid speeches and stupidly sensationalist press false reports naturally spread at breakneck speed and create a climate of anxiety, dread, fear and unpleasant thoughts and feelings, not infrequently to the point of hysteria and panic. In truth, however, the whole thing must be dealt with very objectively, although nothing must be played down either, as for example in relation to the dangers for allergy sufferers when they are stung by bees, hornets, or other wasps. Normally, however, there is no danger at all for human beings, because in reality it is good to live together with hornets, also with Asian hornets, if calmness and common sense are maintained. With regard to the Asian hornet, which has already become native to Europe, it is to be said that it is no threat whatsoever to honeybees, because in most weakened bee colonies cannot be affected. This is also true when the Asian hornet preys on honeybees in order to rear its larvae, just as the hornets native to Europe do. However, this is absolutely irrelevant, because in strong honeybee colonies the queen bee lays up to 20 eggs per day, so the preying of isolated honeybees by the native or the Asian hornets is of no importance at all.
Vespa mandarina.
The whole of the demonizing press reports and ridiculous folklore concerning hornets and wasps in general, as well as specifically concerning the Asian hornet, has fundamentally nothing to do with the Japanese hornet, which is effectively aggressive and which is probably not infrequently mistakenly regarded as the Asian hornet and thus confused, and which moreover at least at present is not yet making a name for itself in Europe. The Asian hornet, which has several thousand individuals per colony, usually builds its nest, which can be up to 1 meter high and 80 centimeters wide, at a height of more than 10 meters in the treetops, so that it can hardly be seen if dense foliage prevails. It is also a fact that hornets, like wasps and bees, are basically peaceful insect contemporaries and, as insect hunters, do not attack and sting human beings or animals for no reason. As a rule, they all only become aggressive when they are harassed and disturbed by human beings or animals, especially when their nests and brood are disturbed or destroyed. Bees, hornets, and wasps are neither vicious nor dangerous if left alone. Every year bees, hornets, and wasps come, and every year many human beings are frightened and annoyed for no reason at all by these insects, which are really quite harmless if left alone and not disturbed or annoying. Unfortunately, there are always many newspaper reports regarding the dangerousness of these insects, which unnecessarily increases the fear or even dread of these conspicuous creatures. However, exaggerated fear or scaremongering through sensational reports does not do justice to either bees or hornets and wasps. Firstly, a bee is harmless if left alone, and further, not every yellow-black insect is also a hornet or wasp, and secondly, only 2 species of wasps become a nuisance in the worst case if they are disturbed or made to attack by flailing around. When people think of hornets and wasps, they first think of the yellow and black insects with the dreaded sting. But wasp is also the name for almost all insects called Hymenoptera. Only bees, bumblebees and ants are given their own name in this group. With regard to wasps, there are leaf wasps, dagger wasps, will wasps, ignimum wasps, path wasps, and many others. Wasps are actual insect hunters. For example, a worker wasp captures a winged hen and cuts off its legs, head, and wings to then feed the portioned prey to larvae in the wasp nest.
Drones.
In late summer, male sexuals also appear, which, unlike female wasps, have a longer abdomen and one more abdominal ring, as well as a longer antenna limb, which allows them to be distinguished from worker wasps. Male wasps do not have a defensive sting, consequently they cannot sting. Wasps of all species, including hornets, can build their nests in very different places, such as in a birdhouse, in a shutter box, under house roofs, in hollow trees and walls, while other species of wasps build their nests in the soil of meadows, and so on. Wood from tree trunks, fence posts, or garden furniture, and so on, is moistened and then scraped off with the mandibles, formed into a ball of paper, and taken to the nest, where the material is immediately used to expand the nest shell or build honeycombs. The wasps that are particularly disliked by human beings are species of the wrinkled wasps. This name describes a peculiarity of the wing, which is folded lengthwise when at rest. Unfounded fear, dread, and bad press give wasps above average attention. However, if human beings would learn more about these insects, they would find answers to the same questions over and over again. Are wasps really poisonous and dangerous? What do they have a sting for? Do hornets and wasps need to be protected? And how can human beings protect themselves from them? How must human beings behave in general with regard to bees, hornets, bumblebees, and wasps? It must be said that an encounter with these useful insects is usually associated with anxiety, fear, and insecurity on the part of those human beings who know nothing at all about these creatures. The fact is that, as a rule, there is no cause for fear or anxiety, because with understanding, sensible behavior, and a little knowledge, there is no danger whatsoever of being stung by such an insect. This is also the case if bees, hornets, bumblebees, or wasps have nested in the nearby vicinity, which can be very interesting objects of observation for young and old. Bees, hornets, bumblebees, and wasps are not aggressive in principle, so they can be observed and studied very well from a close distance, even if you stay calm. The situation is different with the Africanist American honeybees, which, however, do not yet occur in Europe. These are honeybees in the tropical and subtropical zones of the American double continent.
Crossing.
They are repeatedly created by mixing bee colonies managed by beekeepers with occasionally added queens of European descent and drones of dominant, wild bee colonies of African descent. Both these hybrids and also just the wild bees are often referred to as killer bees because of their aggressiveness. The following is recommended when single or multiple bees, hornets, bumblebees, or wasps, or even whole swarms occur, or when their nests are established in human surroundings.
Behavior with bees.
If a swarm of bees appears, please do not disturb it, but inform a local beekeeper immediately before the insects move on. Bee swarms should be caught by experts within a reasonable period of time and passed on to the beekeepers. If one or more bees appear in general, they should not be agitated by waving them around, because if they are kept calm, they will not start to defend themselves, which will lead to defensive stings. Behavior with wasps. When wasps appear, no action is necessary, only thoughtful calm. The presence of these insects in their nests does not usually require any action, because if the insects are not disturbed or made aggressive by waving their hands and arms or objects around, then they remain peaceful and harmless. In the case of wasps of any kind in general, the same principle applies as with bees, because wasps should also not be made agitated by waving them around. Also in this case, if calm is maintained, then no defensive agitation will emanate from them, leading to attacks and defensive stings. Behavior with hornets. No immediate action necessary. Hornets are relatively peaceful, but if their nest or surroundings are disturbed or agitated by vibrations, then the hornets resort to a massive defense by attacking anything that can be moved, with a radius of 2 to 6 meters depending on the colony. In September or October at the latest, the states perish, only the young queens overwinter. The same behavioral pattern applies to hornets as to all wasps and bees, so when hornets appear, keep calm and don't flail around, so these insects don't attack or sting.
More rarely by a bumblebee.
If a human being is stung by a bee, a hornet, or another wasp, the best way is to quickly move away from the area of such insects, because a sting releases alarm pheromones that attract other human beings and make them aggressive and thus ready to sting. Thus, A greater distance of about 10-20 meters from the site of the stung insect should be quickly gained. A sting is painful and afterwards also somewhat burning, but if there is no danger of allergy, which under certain exceptional circumstances can be life-threatening, then the pain will quickly subside and cause no harm. A possible danger from stings by bees, hornets, bumblebees, and wasps therefore only exists in the case of severe allergy sufferers, who make up about 4 or 5% of the population. However, a severe and dangerous allergy usually only develops after several stings, although in the case of severe allergy sufferers, even 1-2 stings can have nasty effects. According to statistics, the death rate in Europe is very low, about 1:5,660, so allergy sufferers need not panic unnecessarily as a result of stings by bees, hornets, and other wasps. Now, anyone who has a nest of wildebees, hornets, bumblebees, or wasps in their house, in a birdhouse, in the garden, in the ground, in a barn, in a hollow tree, or in a meadow, and so on should really be happy about this, because it can be recognized and observed that the insect queen has established a state and no longer needs to fly out. This means that she now devotes herself to laying eggs and is cared for by all her numerous following female offspring, the workers, until autumn. These fly in and out and forage far and wide bees and bumblebees' nectar, hornets and wasps, various insects, and all sorts of other nutritious things to feed the larvae in their various stages. Others build the nest incessantly, while others patrol the nest entrance to secure it and ward off foreign intruders. If the bees, hornets, bumblebees, and wasps are disturbed at the immediate entrance or in the immediate vicinity of the nest area, they naturally react very sensitively, even aggressively.
Vespa crabro.
In Europe alone there are thousands of species of wasps, which also includes hornets, which is one of the largest wasp species, along with various even larger plant wasps. Queens can grow to 3, 5 and workers to 2, 5.
Humanidad.
There are 18 known social and 230 solitary wrinkled wasps, as well as about 700 plant wasps and over 80 parasitic insects. Hornets in particular are much more shy than honeybees. As a result, they tend to flee rather than attack, even at a distance of about 2-3 meters from their nest. A hornet colony comprises 100-700 individuals, depending on the situation, but when threatened, only a part of them will defend the nest. And when the hornet's venom is examined, it is found to be less poisonous than that of a honeybee. This is proven by scientific experiments in which animals weighing 1 kilogram were killed by 40 bee stings, while the same animals of the same weight died only after 150-180 hornet stings. For a human being, the estimates are that there is no danger to life from hornet venom until there are more than 10 hornet stings. 4th August 2015, 22:58 Billy.
And there is also the article by Bernadette regarding vitamin, which Jana and Florina also took and forwarded. We have already talked about this in the month of May, wherein you said that you will not go into such issues in the future. However, in relation to the said article, you still want to say whether what was said is of correctness or not.
Of course, I have also read this article and can say that what is described with regard to the vitamin is correct.
Do you know about vitamin? Vitamin, what is it?
Vitamins con 2, 3 and 4.
The fat-soluble vitamins A, and they also include the vitamin complex. Their absorption through food is increased by the simultaneous intake of healthy fats and oils, in some cases even made possible in the first place. The vitamins are stable against oxygen and very heat resistant. They are hardly degraded by cooking or frying. However, when exposed to light, vitamin becomes inactive and quickly loses its bioavailability.
Phalloquinone. Menaquinone.
Vitamin K occurs in 2 natural forms as vitamin K and vitamin K, which is also produced by certain bacteria in the intestines of human beings. According to recent studies, it is synthesized naturally by human beings from vitamin K, phalloquinone. Vitamin K is mainly found in the leaves of various green plants, which should be included in the daily diet to ensure a sufficient supply of vitamin K or to increase the vitamin K levels in the blood. Good sources of vitamin K are, for example, kale, purslane, spinach or leafy salads,
as well as drinks made from various grass powders such as wheatgrass, kamut grass, barley grass, spelt grass, or a combination of different grasses and herbs, but these should come from high-quality sources.
Beetroot.
Other potent suppliers of vitamin K are, for example, beetroot leaves, which contain more minerals and nutrients than the tubers, which are considered particularly healthy. The various types of cabbage such as Brussels sprouts, broccoli or white cabbage are also highly recommended for covering vitamin K requirements, while sauerkraut is a good supplier of vitamin K due to its content of microorganisms. Herbs such as chives and parsley as well as avocado are rich in vitamin K, whereby avocado also provides the valuable fats necessary for absorption. However, avocado consumption also promotes the absorption of many other fat-soluble substances such as vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, alpha and beta-carotene, lutein, lycopene, zeaxanthin and calcium. Vitamin K is produced by microorganisms, among others also by bacteria of the intestinal flora, and can be absorbed directly via the intestinal cells. A healthy intestine, as an important organ of the immune system, is the basis for the supply of nutrients and trace elements. Sources of vitamin K include raw sauerkraut, butter, egg yolk, liver and some types of cheese.
Functions of vitamin K in the body.
Vitamin K primarily regulates the blood's ability to clot. However, high doses of vitamin K do not lead to increased blood clotting or to a risk of thrombosis because the body uses the vitamin K optimally and thus ensures a balance in blood clotting. A vitamin K deficiency, on the other hand, inhibits the blood's ability to clot, which can lead to increased bleeding. Vitamin K is also important for the prevention and regression of arteriosclerosis or hardening of the arteries. As a result of poor and unhealthy nutrition, blood pressure rises and causes microscopic cracks in the inner walls of the arteries, which the body tries to repair. If the necessary vital substances such as vitamin K and vitamin E are missing, it resorts to cholesterol, which attracts calcium and other substances from the blood, which then plug the cracks. These calcium deposits are called plaque and can cause heart attacks and strokes when they break away from the inner walls of the arteries. Calcium is an important mineral that plays an important role in numerous processes, not only in the formation of bones and teeth. If the body cannot remove calcium from the blood due to disease or malnutrition, it is absorbed by the walls of the blood vessels, which can lead not only to dangerous hardening of the arteries, but probably also to kidney stones. Vitamin K has been shown to remove excess calcium from the blood and ensure that it is not deposited in the blood vessels or kidneys, but is channeled into the bones and teeth. It thus reduces the risk of arteriosclerosis as well as presumably also kidney stones. Studies over a period of 10 years have shown that a diet rich in vitamin K significantly reduces the formation of plaque and that the risk of associated diseases such as heart attacks and strokes is reduced by 50%. However, it is not only vitamin K that plays a special role in the function of blood vessel protection, but also vitamin D in sufficiently high doses, which is equally indispensable for producing the matrix glycoprotein that provides the actual protection against calcification. Studies conducted in the user on rats have shown that vitamin K is even capable of reversing existing arteriosclerosis. Certain blood-thinning drugs can have the side effect of preventing vitamin K from regulating calcium levels in the blood, which can lead to arteriosclerosis. Higher doses of vitamin K have been shown to reduce pre-existing arteriosclerosis in animals by 50%. In addition to calcium and vitamin D, healthy and strong bones also need vitamin K, which carries the required calcium from the blood and into the bones and teeth. In addition, vitamin K activates the protein osteocalcin, which is involved in bone formation and can only bind the calcium and incorporate it into the bones through the action of vitamin K. Studies from 2005 have shown that a vitamin K deficiency in older women leads to lower bone density and an increased risk of bone fractures. Other studies, on the other hand, were able to prove that bone loss in people who already had osteoporosis could be suppressed by administering large amounts of vitamin 2 and that bone formation could even be stimulated again. The importance of a sufficient supply of vitamins K and 2 is proven by studies in which high vitamin levels could be detected, but there was an undersupply of the vitamins. In these cases, the risk of osteoporosis was even increased. Vitamin 2 also seems to play an important role in leukemia. Research with cancer cells in the test tube suggests that vitamin 2 can trigger the self-destruction of leukemia cells. In a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, it was shown that only 10% of the test subjects who had an increased risk of liver cancer also developed cancer when they were given vitamin 2 as a food supplement. In the comparison group, which did not receive any additional vitamin 2, a full 47% developed liver cancer.
Vitamin deficiency.
Apparently, many human beings are not aware of the importance of the two vitamins and the great role they play in health. Experts have found that a great many human beings have too low a level of vitamin K in their blood and that deficiency symptoms are very widespread among those who eat poorly. Moreover, many human beings do not even know that and how they can prevent vitamin deficiency.
Vitamin requirement.
The German Nutrition Society recommends at least 65 ug for women and 80 ug for men, or 0.31
micrograms.
5 ug per kg of body weight daily. For children, 10 ug per kg body weight daily is recommended. This is sufficient to activate the clotting factors in the liver, but not for the functions beyond that. Since breastfed infants are exposed to the risk of clinically relevant vitamin deficiency with the danger of dangerous brain hemorrhages, vitamin prophylaxis is recommended in most countries of the world. An overdose of vitamin K is most likely not possible. At least no such case has ever been reported, even at a dose of 40 ug per day. The recommended intake is about 65 ug to 100 ug daily. Overall, with a normal diet, more serious hypovitaminoses are rare unless requirements are measured against the needs of osteoporosis prophylaxis, which requires much higher doses. For long-term osteoporosis prophylaxis, doses of 180 ug daily are recommended based on a study by Dutch researchers. Since it can be assumed that the recommendations are absolute minimums that only just ensure blood clotting, but do not take into account all the other tasks that the vitamins have to fulfill, it seems appropriate to ensure oneself that the supply of vitamins K and 2 is covered beyond the officially recommended level. This is all the more advisable because the two vitamins K and 2 are not toxic, even in high doses. There is no such thing as vitamin hypervitaminosis, with the exception of substitution treatment in the newborn, where vitamin K in high doses can trigger hemolysis because the infant's organism is not yet able to cope with certain mechanisms to a sufficient degree. It may well be advisable to reconsider taking food supplements with vitamin 2. It should be taken into account that vitamins 2 and 3 act together with calcium, which suggests that an all-round supply of calcium, vitamin 2 and vitamin 3 should be considered. More information on vitamin K and vitamin 2 can be found on the internet, including Wikipedia, Centrum de Gesundheit and Herstein-Will, which provides a good table of vitamin-containing foods. Bernadette Brand, Switzerland.
Now the time has come to abolish cash, which we have talked about before. I also gave the two girls an article for you on that written by Marian.
And which I have of course also read and must say is good.
The horrendous lies of the authorities, bankers, economists, and economic practices, as well as the screaming naivety and thoughtlessness of the masses of people, lead to total surveillance and expropriation. Horror visions become reality.
The battle against cash has begun. Michael Rastch, NS 22. 5. 2015.
Remin Paymani. Peter Buffinger. Slogan of the Swedish cash opponents. Borsexual.
The Trojan horse, frontal attack on coined freedom, the surveillance state lux, de glaser and Finanzbogenehen, Munzen und Gelddienstdien en Atronismus, Bargeldbrot no Dienome und de Bankrobe, Ökonomen Forden Diabschaffung des Bargelds. To negative instead Vereines well, Michael Rasch, NS 29. 5. 2015. Such and similar headlines in paper and online newspapers refer to the hard-hitting intentions of the authorities, bankers, economists and so-called economic experts. What a silly name, to take away the most popular means of payment, namely cash, from the people by hypocritical and dishonest means and to turn them, the human beings, into transparent and manipulated citizens and finally to expropriate them. Manfred Petrich, alias Freeman, who himself worked in the financial and investment banking sector and now enlightens readers about the machinations of the rip-off elite in his extremely interesting blog Ulstellen Rauch, wrote already at the end of 2011 under the title Monta wants to turn Italy into a cashless society about the dangers and debt accumulation by banks and via credit cards. See Ulstellen Rauch on 18 April 2014, at the 585th official contact. Billy Edward Albert Meyer and Schwich Petter talked, among other things, about the creeping abolition of cash and the intended total surveillance of Earth human beings. The two gentlemen could have spoken about this much earlier, because they know the future and know what horrible misery will befall us Earthlings if we do not finally see through the intentions and machinations of the so-called economic elite, the powerful, and rulers and their servants and henchmen and put an inglorious end to them. Whereas in earlier times the statements were merely prophecies, the effects of which could still have been changed by correct thinking and action, the longer they go on, the more they turn into predictions.
In this context, see also Linux prophecies, predictions of the prophets, until the third millennium in and predicted warnings of your government in 1888.
Documents mostly available as Pfunder download. Billy and Ptaah's words were published in FIGU's Special Bulletin No. 79 of July 2014, but shall be repeated for corroboration.
But I have another question, and that is regarding credit cards, which are being used more and more. Could it be that credit cards are a way of eventually getting cash out of official circulation altogether? By this I don't mean that cash will be abolished and a moneyless form will emerge as you have with you. Rather, it seems to me that this is precisely what is being worked towards, so that money will only exist in the banks and thus human beings can be controlled in a total way with regard to cash as well as possessions, goods and assets.
You are really grasping the whole thing before anything is officially made noisy about it, because in fact this is exactly what is being worked towards in a secret way by the banks and the financial powers of various states. In this way, the Earth human beings are ultimately to be controlled in a totalitarian way down to the smallest piece of money and also in terms of taxation and financially exploited with more and more compulsory levies. The whole thing is therefore not aimed at creating a system without money, but in reality to bring about total control of Earth human beings with regard to their money, possessions and assets. Such total control, as well as total surveillance of every human being, is especially sought by the EU.
The control chip that has been announced since the 1960s, which is to be implanted in every human being, which will then contain all their birth, illness, life and social data and so on, in order to monitor them in a totalitarian way and to be able to determine exactly where they are at any given moment down to the centimeter. To a certain extent, this is already being done with dogs and cats as well as with other pets and even with wild animals. Finally, there is the last horror vision of mental surveillance and control, that is, that the thoughts and feelings of human beings are also controlled as well as their desires, needs, wishes, actions, deeds and behavior. And if it really comes to that, this mental control is certain visions of the future have been depicting since the 1960s and even since time immemorial, then the human being will be completely robbed of his personal freedom by those in power in the governments. And indeed, for some time now, many things have been pointing to the fact that everything is moving towards the visions. When I think of the EU, it has been carrying out dictatorial measures and methods to suppress democracy since its very beginning, whereby the state powers subjugate every political, social, and cultural life in its entirety according to the leader principle of all dictators such as Hitler, Stalin, Saddam Hussein, Ceausescu, and so on, and regulate everything and anything by force.
It is not there yet. But you are right that the overall development is moving in that direction in terms of totalitarian control, surveillance and oppression of Earth human beings, just as ancient prophecies set it out. Of course, total surveillance does not happen from one day to the next, but is successively planned over decades, even if it looks to the uninitiated as if something is completely new. What is often not noticed or negated is the fact that everything is connected by the law of causality.
See also Existent Life in the Universe, Billy, FIGU Aquarian Time Publishing.
Everything that moves in the universe and everything does move has an influence on everything else and knows about everything else. For millennia, ways and means have been sought again and again to manipulate the foot people and make them compliant. Now, at the beginning of the 21st century, certain narrow-minded politicians and economic wise men,
Swiss National Bank.
Peter Bofinger, who received the toilet seat from Raman Payment for his proposal to abolish cash, seemed to have found a way via negative interest rates, especially in the EU dictatorship and its vassals, the Swiss government and the EU turbos, not the people. This and the central banks want to attack money via negative interest rates. However, negative interest can only be levied on account balances.
Cash.
So it is. The money must go. The transparent citizen sends his regards. Have you already thought about what it would mean for you to no longer have any small change or banknotes in your wallet? Only one or more credit cards that you have to use for all your payments. What would it be like for you if the police arrested you and searched your flat or house because you wanted to pay a larger amount in cash? Some short-sighted among you will probably shrug their shoulders now and think, so what? They do not care. I do not have any money anyway. Besides, it is much easier. Then nothing can be stolen from me either, and the state knows everything about me anyway. Of course, organized crime and money laundering can also be made more difficult, but anyone who assumes that these corrupt regimes and mafia organizations would not find ways and means to smuggle their illegally acquired assets into the legal, financial, and economic cycle is probably mistaken.
For the state.
Moreover, should these indisputable advantages really be weighted higher than our individual freedom, please go through some actions in your head that you always do with cash.
Interesting in this context is the book Blackout Tomorrow It's Too Late techno-thriller by Mark Ellsberg.
For example, how will you tip your newspaper carrier at the end of the year in the future? Do you make a transfer so that he can be taxed? How do you resolve the regular contribution to your granddaughter and / your grandson or someone else you like? For example, your mistress or lover. How do you make it clear to the tax authorities that this is not a reportable employment relationship, but a noble supported gesture? Do you want to have to constantly justify to the state why you spend money on this and that? Do you want to be under constant pressure to explain yourself, to justify yourself? Moreover, and very importantly, have you already thought about how you will pay in the event of a power cut? What about gold? Would gold also be banned as a means of payment? And jewelry and other so-called valuables? Would you even want to save money if you were only taxed with negative interest rates and other levies? What about compulsory expropriations if the state, with its horrendous mountain of debt, needed money and chose you to pay part of it, or the municipality wants to house refugees in your flat or house? Does the idea that the refugee family of 10 will breed out in your house and you will be compensated with a cellar hole, if at all, give you a good feeling? Interesting and frightening at the same time what is happening in Sweden and can be read at the link student, Swangsentingen van Agentums Immobilien för Asylanten. Fortunately, we have a partial democracy in Switzerland. And so I very much hope that the sensible and reasonable as well as forward-thinking voting citizens will prevent excesses of the sin and the state at the ballot box.
Radio frequency identification equals identification with the help of electromagnetic waves.
What comes next when the state exercises sovereignty over our finances? Does it also want sovereignty over our thoughts, feelings and actions? Credit cards and other cards are already equipped with RFID technology. We can be located via our smartphones/mobile phones. So in RFID dictatorship chip in the head, the authorities will then determine what you think, who you're with, what job you do, who you marry, and what you will or will not do. A horror vision. See also excerpt from Contact 512 in FIGU Special Bulletin No. 68//figu.org/variant/periodica/sunder bulletin/2011/60, already in FIGU Bulletin No. 2 of May 1995, writes Billy Edward Albert Meir, beam under the title Surveillance Systems, among other things, the following. The surveillance system of the Americans is also the first step towards the future horror vision, the total control of Earth human beings. A vision which expresses that Earth human beings will soon no longer be able to take a step without being observed and controlled by an all-encompassing surveillance system, whereby human beings will be implanted with a code chip through which total control will become possible, whereby the human being will no longer be able to be unobserved and uncontrolled in any way, not even in his most private and intimate activities.
European Union.
In Europe, the vision shows the all-encompassing surveillance center is to be located in Brussels, directed and controlled by the European Union, as it calls itself today, in whose secret sense it also lays to establish a form of dictatorship, from which the total surveillance of the citizen will then result. The horror vision that is beginning to be realized more and more and is recognizable to anyone who still observes the world with open eyes. But also a horror vision that heralds the New World Order, which since time immemorial has been linked to the prophecy that the beast with the number 666 will exercise its mighty power. A prophecy and vision about which I intend to report in a responsible form in the FIGU Bulletin, among many other important things about which Earth human beings should be oriented. If all the foregoing and what else you can think of still does not concern you, or, even worse, even agree with it, it is useful to address freedom and its effective meaning again. Freedom is not only being able to choose and decide between different possibilities without constraint and not being trapped, and so on, but freedom is a state of consciousness. True freedom implies independence from burdensome things, whether physical or psychological, but also freedom from constraints of one's own or others' nature.
Mental block equals consciousness, thoughts, feelings, and psyche.
Freedom also includes, among other things, the freedom of self-determination and the freedom to use reason and understanding, and so on. True freedom is an inner freedom that belongs to the human mental block. In other words, the human being builds and nourishes his freedom and consciousness through his thoughts, their feelings, and the psyche. Obeying the laws and commandments of human beings enables the human being to endure a threatening or simply unpleasant condition and to make the best of it for himself without despair. However, if a chip is implanted in the human being's head through which his own thoughts are overridden, his evolution of consciousness stagnates. He becomes a dictatorship puppet. Is that what you want? The powerful and the rulers are very clever. They shamelessly exploit the joy of innovation and technology as well as the urge to play and research, but also the delusion of faith, the belief in authority, the need for dependency, the envy of food, the degenerated joy of childbearing, the hurriedness, the unwillingness to learn, the laziness to think, the forgetfulness, the stupidity, the indifference, the ignorance, the comfort, and the latent autism, especially of the younger generation, lying shamelessly in their own favor. And they thus achieve their goal, which they are dangerously close to for the normal Earth human beings.
Commandments equals recommendations.
The ladies and gentlemen of authority and all others of the same or similar color have been suffering from the same symptoms since time immemorial. They are partly sick in their consciousness, do not abide by any creative laws and commandments, futile about justice, and interpret ethics in their own depraved or false human sense. Such human beings are either completely naive and somehow stupid, or then unfeeling and compassionate psychopaths of varying degrees. If they have a goal in mind, they pursue it at whatever cost to others. However, they are not only unfeeling, uncompassionate, fearless, and ruthless, but also extremely clever, charming, winning, and endowed with an extraordinary capacity for thought. See FIGU Special Bulletin No. 72. How to recognize a human being as a psychopath. Billy. The following statement by Ptaah from the 567th official contact from the 6th of July 2013 points to the noble character of many suggestive impulse recipients and the lust for power and destruction of the military rulers and the powerful, which should be mentioned to substantiate what I have said. The whole of what has been discussed in this regard can be read in FIGU-Bulletin No. 83. All that you have said is correct. And unfortunately it is indeed the case that Earth human beings always tend to use everything for might, for harassment and for destruction, and so on. It is true that we send impulses to all those who receive suggestive impulses from us due to development and progress, in each individual case also impulses which were directed towards a peaceful use of all new developments, but those in power and those in military power and other powerful forces worked against this. And unfortunately the researchers, scientists, inventors and developers always let themselves be beguiled by them. Consequently, out of much that we put into the capable of research, science and development for the good of Earth human beings through unconscious suggestive impulses for development and progress, in the end a great deal was created that only brought death and destruction. And this is what happened with regard to all technology of every kind, physics, chemistry, medicine and all other sciences. In fact, the knowledge gained and developments made by Earth human beings in all fields over the last 170 years would only have come about in the first centuries of the third millennium without our suggestive impulsive aid to development and progress. Unfortunately, however, all researchers, scientists and developers who were involved in our suggestive impulses were either corrupt, greedy for profit, naive or so weak in self-confidence that they bowed to the demands of the powerful.
From 1844 onwards.
However, it is also to be said that various ones were coerced by the ruling, powerful and criminal elements, while others simply feared for their lives and therefore submitted to the will of the rulers and the military, and so on. In connection with technology it is worth mentioning, which is already evident from Ptaah's statement above, that it was the Plejadian who, during the past 170 years, provided the earthly researchers, scientists, inventors and developers with suggestive impulses to speed up the whole development enormously. In the 585th official contact from the 18th of April 2014, Ptaah explains why the Plejadian gave apparatus hypnotic development impulses to selected scientists. Full text to be read in FIGU Special Bulletin No. 79, July 2014. Without these unconscious suggestive impulses for development and progress, the human beings of the Earth would still be without electronics, without nuclear power and without good medicine, schooling, and so on, and without today's danger of total electronic surveillance.
Whereby it must be said that the surveillance, denunciation, and the monstrous outrages of the Catholic Church during the Inquisition, which has continued since the beginning of the 13th century, until today, are for the time being only far surpassed in their viciousness, brutality, and disgracefulness by the Islamic State.
Everything always has two sides, a positive and a negative, and so on. Everything can always be used both positively and negatively. If the positive degenerates, it is just as negative as if the negative degenerates. Just as the car only becomes an instrument of murder when the driver uses it to drive a human being to death, the networked computer only becomes a damaging instrument because of the programs that are created, loaded into the computer and executed by wrong-thinking and vile human beings. It is always the human beings with their degenerate thinking who abuse the technology. It is not the technology per se.
Stock exchanges and markets. Head of stock exchanges. Negative interest stands for an insane world. Big misgivings about banning cash and ideas about taxing it.
How is it even possible that it could come to this, that even in this on the 29th of May 2015 in its column Borsen unmarked in an article by Michael Rast with the title Der Negatives and Stadtvereinungswelt, Subtitel Großbedingten gegen das Verbot von Bargeld und Identisiener Besteuerung, and in the text itself speaks of financial repression and alienating thinking, on whom or what can Earth human beings shift the responsibility for what they are now facing, on a God, or to the coincidence so beloved of scientists? Not at all. Everything that is going on is the human being's own fault. Assuming that the Earth's population of 529 million human beings were a reality, Earth's population on 31/12/2014, 00 equals 8,532,48,7 human beings. Would it then occur to anyone to harass their fellow human beings, torture them, slit their throats, rob them of their possessions, goods and assets, and want to totally monitor and manipulate them? Hardly. So all evil is fundamentally due to our massive overpopulation, and the stupidity of human beings in not containing it, and in not turning to the creative laws and commandments. The human being personally provides the causes for his condition, for ultimately everything is fulfilled on the basis of causality, and so on the creative natural law of cause and effect. Causality is by no means the product of chance, it is the law of cause and effect, which means that a cause gives rise to consequential processes that fit together seamlessly and consequently become the providence that subsequently forms the effect. In the entire universe, the universal system of law and order is at work, to which the creative natural law of causality also belongs. Causality is a factor of cause and effect is formed by the creative natural laws and commandments in such a way that its effects or results work in moral, psychic and physical as well as in action, deed, ideas, thoughts and feelings, but also in all other possible areas. The law of causation is not such that the causes and effects as such are determined by creation, but that these are created by the human being himself, and by all life forms as well as by everything that exists universally, and by all events that come into being.
See teaching scripture for the teaching of truth, teaching of spirit, teaching of life, Billy/Beam Figure Aquarian Time Publishing House.
The primordial law of all existence, which also includes the law of causality, cannot be put down because even before the Big Bang creation universal consciousness had thought of or coded all creative laws and commandments spiritually over trillions of years. This code, which consists of fine material spirit energy physical impulses, contains everything concerning cause and effect, but not the causes themselves. These come, as it were, from outside the code, thus, as already mentioned above, through all life forms as well as through everything that exists universally and through all events that come into being. However, they have an effect on the code, because every energy, every particle, every thought, every action, every word, every feeling and every impulse are causes and trigger very specific effects. The causes produce movement and cause everything that comes out of them to be directed in certain directions and produce effects that are determined by the causes. While it is going on now, and so on the frontal attack on our cash, the intended total surveillance and expropriation, is the effect of all the preceding causes, fusions and effects that in turn became causes.
Religious.
Without all the wars, the corrupt, murderous and dictatorial elements, the national debts, the massive overpopulation, and so on, we would not have the condition we find ourselves in now. Consequently, the danger of the abolition of cash, negative interest rates, surveillance, expropriation, and so on cannot be considered individually.
Equals causes.
The following list names facts of the current world reality with an increasing tendency, whether they are seen or perceived as such or not. They are a fact.
Existing causes.
How do these causes affect us human beings, our living spaces, and our well-being? Do you see an ideal world in which even more children are to be born in order to implant a chip in them immediately after birth? Do you think that the extent of what has been said will be reduced without Earth human beings actively bringing about a change for the good and positive on the basis of insight, reason, and understanding, and of course the study of the creative laws and commandments? Please look at the points and try to fathom the effects from the given causes with foresight. Mental depravity, dictatorial lust for power, lack of justice, greed for money, greed for exploitation, lust for oppression, lust for manipulation by the ruling class. Enormous national debt, fraud and deceit. Unemployment, housing shortage, food shortage, water shortage due to massive overpopulation and the associated aggressiveness, blackmail and also fear of the population. Storms, climate catastrophes with primeval conditions. Environmental catastrophes, air pollution, famines, asylum seekers and economic refugees problem, mixing of peoples.
Religious.
Fanaticism, war, robbery, murder and manslaughter, increasing brutality towards uninvolved and innocent human beings. Murderous and destructive weapons. Melting of the polar ice caps. Computer and electronic hacking, unwanted intelligence activities. Space problems on the roads and in public transport and so on, increasing susceptibility to disease, cancer, epidemics, and so on, also as a result of poisoning the seeds with toxic substances, and so on, false human thinking delusion. Illogical thinking, and so on, purely material and against the laws of creation. Satisfaction in betraying the freedom of consciousness and will of human beings. Shameful naivety and stupidity of the followers, the pro and pro-hate creators and the passive shoulder-shrugging foot people. The scientists' megalomania, blackmail, fear and obedience.
Computer science, medicine, engineering, and so on. Computers, programs, networks, smartphones, RFID chips, implantation technology, credit cards, and so on and so on.
High technology in various fields and corresponding instruments, tools and means of blackmail, inability to foresee, and so on, inability to recognize an effect from an existing cause and act accordingly in a correct way, and so on, and so on. If you have come to a similar or the same conclusion as Billy Edward Albert Mears/Beam describes in his own words in the following text, then you have a talent for network thinking and can look reality in the eye. Words of Beam, from the 583rd contact from the 19th of March 2014. The full text is in FIGU Special Bulletin No. 79, July 2014.
And when I consider the scenario that you described to me, it was, I think, during a private conversation in 1990 that may arise in the future with earthly human beings as a result of overpopulation and the resulting worldwide destruction of nature, fauna and flora, the climate, as well as the social cohesion of human beings and the emergent breakdown of interpersonal relationships, then I dread. And when I think of what you said about the deterioration of the cultural and ethical and moral conscientious behavioral and educational values of the human beings of the earth who, with regard to all things of existence in life, are falling into complete indifference and even hostility towards one another, then the present proves to me that these conditions have already been reached and are now rapidly progressing. In addition, you said that this was the beginning of the downfall of society and could even lead to the downfall of humanity if all the evils were not changed. You spoke of a period of about 200 years sooner or later, that this catastrophe would result if the earthlings did not find their way back to the effective values of life and existence, in particular also to the fact that overpopulation would be stopped and the mass of humanity normalized by a worldwide birth stop. Cash withdrawal, total surveillance and expropriation are merely logical stages on the way to the downfall of society. A horror vision. Marian Wielander, Switzerland. Then we have discussed everything regarding all the articles, so we can turn to other things such as when the Swiss National Bank will actually start issuing new banknotes. You promised me last year that you would look into this matter. For years it was said again and again that the new banknotes would be issued in Switzerland after all, but each time everything was thrown out. So far nothing has gone because nothing has happened so far for this year 2015 either, although it was said that new banknotes would be put into circulation in the course of the summer or after.
Unfortunately, I neglected to tell you that I had clarified the matter. A date has now been set for late spring next year, and so on 2016. I have also promised you that by the middle of this year I will tell you the result of our clarification regarding the effective use of it. By the middle of this year. Due to my absence, I am somewhat late with my clarification of the result, but this has shown that during the last 5 years of observation of the clarification and effective value of a daily average work performance for 8 hours has resulted, converted according to the actual daily work performance of a normal strong earthly man who works 8 to 2 hours per day.
Contact Report 625 Translation, Part 4. Important note: this is an official and authorized translation of a FIGU publication. Translator, FIGU-Landesgruppe Australia. Date of original translation, Tuesday, 15th December 2015.
Just this week there was talk about this, although not this figure, but some things were mentioned in this regard. Consequently, the statement was only slightly off the mark. But something else, the Islamist state continues to commit ongoing machinations which are felonious and very badly out of the control of the good human nature, against which the Iraqi and Syrian military as well as the British and American aircraft squadrons which are deployed against the IS do much too little and not the right thing to exterminate the Islamist state. On one hand, many military people and pilots probably enjoy being able to make war, whereby probably love of adventure or a joy of killing and destroying play a decisive role. On the other hand, with the entire matter of the lax actions against the participating countries, profit-making plays an extremely important role. This is namely in that form because through the lax and almost useless munitions wasting battles and machinations of the regular military as well as of the foreign air forces who hurl masses of rockets and bombs, the weapon industry which delivers all the munitions for the fruitless actions against the is kept alive, whereby naturally also the countries themselves profit to a great extent. This is so because they collect immense taxes from the manufacturers of fighter aircraft, weapons, munitions, rockets and bombs. Aside from that, the foreigners, especially the USA, can implant themselves into Iraq, into Syria, into Afghanistan and recently also into Turkey and claim that they are providing assistance against the Islamist state. In this form they spread out in the countries concerned, as in the first position the USA has always done already for ages all over the world and also will continue to do, whereby it can indulge in its world control imperialism, that is to say it can increasingly expand its endeavoring in its political, military and economic areas of might and influence. And as said, the USA stands ahead of all in regard to this, in conscienceless criminal form which disdains human life and disregards every right, and indeed in felonious form, and it mendaciously and deceitfully acts as world police and the selfless saver of freedom and of the world, and thereby also does not shy away from underhandedly provoking wars as it has done worldwide for ages, so indeed also in Vietnam, out of which decade-long killing, murder, rape and torture, destruction and elimination as well as unspeakably great need, misery, pain and sorrow came forth.
National Security Agency.
At that time, namely it was on the 4th of August 1964, as I know from your daughter Simyase as well as from you in Quetzal, and about which I also have read something, the American Secret Service searched for a felonious way to provoke a war against the communist North Vietnam, although North Vietnam in no form had given a reason for war actions. Therefore, in the South China Sea, on the destroyer Maddox, then some manufactured a faulty sonar echo, that is to say, a false sonar echo, in order to let those agents officially act, and indeed in the form that they consciously, falsely, and mendaciously presented the harmless and false sonar echo created by them as a torpedo attack of the Viet Cong. All falsified information, reports and coordinates which arose from that, which were consciously manufactured through lies and deception, proceeded immediately through the news filter of the Secret Service, which also manipulated and falsified all radio signals, photos and sea maps, and indeed besides which on the destroyer Maddox they induced an intentionally false and therefore alleged and effectively invented major combat and torpedo alarm. As a consequence, naturally the warship changed its course, whereby with the heavy twin turrets of the destroyer it opened fire for several hours on the imaginary and non-existent enemy, and there was wild shooting across the ocean. In addition to this, on the same day retaliation attacks on the city of Hanoi were carried out by the aircraft carrier Ticonderoga with fighter aircraft. Naturally, no Viet Cong ships, submarines or torpedoes were encountered at sea because neither were there any in the area of the destroyer, nor was North Vietnam taking part in the entire thing at all. The fact is that a perfect theatrical performance was launched by them, so which served to make it possible for the USA to involve Viet Cong in a war, in the hope that North Vietnam could be annexed into the area of USA world control by the USA armed forces. But that was a complete flop because North Vietnam did not let itself be brought into line. Rather, it humiliated the use of the strongest army of the world at that time and gave its armed forces one hammering after another during the 10-year war, and finally a complete moral and military defeat in a lost war. According to your earlier explanations, unfortunately this Vietnam War cost more than 6.5 million human lives, whereby however it is today claimed that it had only been 5 million human lives. Fundamentally also still to be said is that the armed forces in general, therefore those of all countries, are trained to boundlessly and consciencelessly kill and murder, whereby also monstrous war crimes of many forms are committed, and also women and children are sexually abused, raped, and along with many non-participating human beings from among the people are tortured, mistreated, and murdered. But if now everything is considered further than just in regard to the mentioned human disdaining and rights disregarding machinations of the USA, then the American human beings step into the focus of examination. It thereby becomes clearly apparent that a great part of the USA population suffers from an irreversible psychosis. With a number for the entire population of around 320 million human beings, the great mass of paranoid ones amounts to a large part of the population which lives in a psychical persecution delusion. In this great number of paranoid ones there are naturally not only simple citizens to mention, rather especially also many politicians, members of the police force, secret service people, economic heads, military personnel, political party members, religionists and sectarians, as well as hate and terrorist groups and so forth. It's all characteristic of them, therefore not only those running amok, who are constantly growing in number in the USA, that they believe themselves to be threatened, persecuted, and betrayed, and have irreversibly fallen into a morbid paranoia out of which they live in the delusion that they have to eradicate, drive out, and kill all those human beings who fit into their racist image of the enemy. Especially all the psychotically ill ones, therefore the paranoiacs who are naturally more or less psychopathically disposed, have cowardly anxiety that they as white as citizens would be killed by human beings of other colors and other races as well as other beliefs. Thereby quite especially the black human beings are at the forefront as the image of the enemy, which is born of the racial delusion of the white psychoses afflicted as Americans, and are accused of wanting to kill and murder the white human beings in order to finally take control of the white race in the USA. And with those with the paranoid personality disorder, this cowardly anxiety and the therewith connected delusion of being murdered as a white female or male by a black human being is completely irrational in the face of the effective facts and truth, which verifiably shows that the probability of being killed by a white human being is 6 times higher than being killed by a black human being. The truth is that only 14% of all white victims of murder are killed by blacks, while, in contrast to that, 84% of the murders of whites are also to be attributed to white as Americans. And to be said with the entire matter in regard to the spreading paranoia in a great part of the US population is that also the federal institutions are befallen by that, whereby in this regard especially the police are at the forefront, because it is a verifiable probability that an Afro-American is 7 times more likely to be shot by security forces than a white human being is. The entire thing is a consequence of the pathological delusion of persecution and of the irrational conspiracy theories, as well as of the paranoid modes of behavior of all race haters in regard to a noteworthy part of the US population, whereby the fact also is that in this regard there is nowhere else in the world where the same or even only similar circumstances prevail as prevail in US America. The cowardly anxiety of the white ones, indeed of the whitest Americans, that the Afro-Americans or other non-white ones in America could take control of the USA and its population is widespread. But in this regard, it is not only the black human beings who dominate the paranoid psychopathic body of thoughts of the US American racists, because truthfully it is also the religions in which they see great dangers, whereby especially the male and female Muslims as well as the male and female Jews embody the racist image of the enemy, because they are supposed to be a threat for the entire country, the religious and sectarian Christian faith, and for the economy. And concerning this, especially paranoid, psychopathic ultra-right-wing Republicans and so-called liberal peace apostles are the greatest screamers, stink-makers and agitators of the people, whereby the Tea Party is certainly at the forefront in this regard and sees a potential terrorist in every believer of Islam and Jewish human being. It is thereby overlooked that alone in America, since the 11th of September 2001, when the World Trade Center was destroyed by Islamist Al-Qaeda terrorists, more terror attacks have been committed by white racists and twice as many human beings have been killed than by radical Islamists and Jews in the USA. And if the racism of the US-Americans is examined further, then also the radical right-wing sin comes into the focus of consideration, whereby it becomes visible that the new Nazis in the USA are well and truly on the hunt to persecute, harm, and even to murder Afro-Americans, Jews, Muslims, Mexicans, and all others who do not belong to the whitest American population. Belonging to these race haters are also the People's Front, Aryan Nations, the 88 and Knights of the Ku Klux Klan and so forth, whereby solely in the Midwest of the USA more than 30 Nazi organizations exist and carry out their evil racial mischief and commit ever more gewalt. One, and that all of that can happen is based on a further reason, being that as a result of unemployment and the climbing poverty, a fertile ground is created for further anxiety and paranoia, which the Nazis and other racists use to win insecure human beings for the racist terror with racist lies and calumnies, whereby especially young ones are radicalized for that. But it is not only the Nazi organizations and the Ku Klux Klan as well as other known racist groups which promote the racism in the USA, because as unbelievable as it sounds, it is effectively also security groups and security organizations such as the FIGU.
Central Intelligence Agency equals Overseas Secret Service of the United States.
Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is the greatest trainer of terrorists in the USA, and the CIA, which stirs up the paranoia in the population everywhere. This is done by persuading human beings who are weak in consciousness or are somehow willing to carry out attacks and acts of terror, after which the perpetrators are, as in a stage play, hunted down and imprisoned, presented to the population through the media, and then convicted. So it is a fact that since the 11th of September 2001 of the altogether 175 failed terror attacks in the USA to the year 2015, only just 6 assassination attempts did not lead back to the federal authorities. The truth also is that, in the USA, since the 11th of September 2001 up to the year 2015, far more than 50 female and male human beings were shot by whites, and in the same time frame 26 by radical Islamists. And further to be said in regard to the US-American weapons delusion is that during the last 14 years in the USA, 30 children were killed through the misuse of firearms, as well as, again since 2001 to 2015, 50 human beings died as a result of handling their own firearms and the accidental triggering of a shot. And if the truth is seen like that, then it is to be recognized that through such occurrences in the USA, very many more victims of death are to be known than through an Islamist, Jewish or other terror attack from non-white human beings, according to the US-American racial delusion.
National Rifle Association.
But that does not stop the world's mightiest American weapons lobby, NRA, from continuing to constantly, nationally advance its insanity of the arming of the population and thereby disregarding the effective facts of the misuse of weapons. The weapons lobby, in which also the entire weapons industry is integrated, does not want to see the truth and also does not concern itself that annually there are thousands of dead to mourn due to weapons, because their interest lays only in financially profiting tremendously, for which reason they also consciously promote the anxiety and the paranoid personality disorders in the population. However, that there be more and more running amok, murder and terror acts come about does not concern them in any form. On the contrary, they use all this very badly, getting out of control of the good human nature to their benefit, because the more that happens in this form, the more they can control the population, and namely because with the running amok, murders and terror acts and the weapons used for that, they have a mighty means of irrational anxiety through which they can dominate and control the human beings. And exactly that is done by the weapons lobby, the weapons industry, the secret services, economic bosses, and other ruling ones, and indeed right up into the official agencies in the government. Therefore, with the use of a paranoid psychopathic nation must be spoken of at least in regard to the psychotic part of the entire population. Were that not the case, how could it otherwise be that there is practically always shooting first and only then questions, as the facts prove? To shoot first and then ask questions is effectively an unwritten and somehow holy rule in the USA, which also proves itself in the police handling of weapons and shooting, because alone in the months of January to May of the year 2015, 385 human beings were shot by police, whereby legalized murder is more likely the right label. And when one thinks of the racism which is also carried out blatantly by the police, then it is not surprising that as a rule 4 times as many black human beings are shot than is the case on the other hand in regard to white human beings. If the situation is exactly considered, then on one hand, cowardly anxiety is the reason for the trigger-happy police. However, on the other hand, being able to exercise their might behavior over other human beings as well as wanting to kill, and indeed especially in regard to the non-whites or those of other faiths who do not fit into their white racial schema. And concerning this, if the entire matter is viewed and considered for the future, then the number of civil victims of the conscienceless cowardly anxiety and the police, who are messing their trousers, will keep on increasing very drastically. And this will happen because the mass of the overpopulation incessantly continues to increase, whereby ever more conflicts of all kinds arise, which especially in the USA are confronted by anxious, cowardly and trigger-happy police who simply consciencelessly shoot and murder the fallible, those who appear to be fallible and therefore innocent ones. And this happens with federal protection because already since time immemorial and in the future, more and more the US government continues to increasingly more massively build up the weaponization and the powers of the police, while the population has nothing or hardly anything to say about that. At the present time in the USA there are over 800 police, whereby a certain number of them effectively are to be labeled killers in uniform and go unpunished after every murder, freely according to the rule that, as police, they have the federally assured right to shoot a human being when they feel threatened or there are other special circumstances of a danger. And the whammy with this rule is that a victim does not even have to carry a weapon or attack a police officer in order to be shot by one, because for that it is definitely enough when a human being speaks or moves clumsily, or when a police officer feels threatened, which very often is completely baseless, as such cases prove again and again. Nevertheless, the racial hatred in the USA spreads further through white USA citizens and continuously and increasingly promotes the revolt against the Afro-Americans and all others who do not fit into the white racial schema of the race haters. This is American racial hatred, and the quite cowardly anxiety about the Afro-Americans and above all about other human beings of diverse countries and religions and so forth corresponds to a pathological, malicious, paranoid, psychopathic personality disorder, which spreads across the entire nation of USA and by which a large part of the US population is befallen. All of the related cowardly anxiety, the racial hatred and the persecution delusion which is integrated into that, as you once said, is on one hand probably based effectively in a genetically inherited memory from the time when the US American world was confronted with this slavery and the therewith connected horror and murders of the slaves which were committed by the Ku Klux Klan and other race haters. On the other hand, as you have also explained, the cowardly anxiety and the persecution delusion has been based since time immemorial in a genetic memory in regard to the source and the cause of the origin of the white first population of the current US America. Indeed, the fact is that the majority of the current US citizens are distant descendants of the early white American immigrants who immigrated to the promised land of that time only because they had to flee from Europe because they were hated, persecuted, and had their lives threatened as a consequence of their diverse religious sectarianism or their criminal lives. that created in them a hatred against all who were not like them, which, in expanded form, expressed itself as a peculiar racial hatred, indeed in regard to all those who had not fallen into a sectism to which not only the simple citizens belonged, rather also the officials and governors. The entire thing is therefore based on a fact which genetically established itself in the sect-believing refugees and over many generations has been preserved deep in the DNA until today. Consequently, a great part of this population is the worst worldwide in regard to the cowardly anxiety of being a victim of a black or other non-white human being. The thoughts and the therefrom arising feelings of the race haters are characterized by being secure with their own body and life only with a weapon and its use against fellow human beings. So that is that, whereby I want to say in addition to that also in regard to it an effective order will have to be created, whereby in particular the racist groups and racist organizations of all kinds, therefore also all Nazi and other groups set up on racial extremism in the use of, must be targeted and stamped out, and indeed through a multinational strike force for peace in accord with the schema of Nokodemian. In addition to that, I still want to say that all that I have mentioned are indisputable facts which quite especially strongly demand that finally a worldwide multinational strike force for peace has to be created, which is trained in creating order, peace and freedom in a form worthy of the human being through duals and dualosicate, and indeed also in the respect that all hatred of foreigners, faiths, religions and races is completely stopped, whereby in this regard in the civilized world the use is in the first position to be combated. With us America it is certainly questionable when all of the racial hatred, the death penalty, the unfair exercising of punishment and administration of justice and so forth is viewed and considered, whether this nation can be spoken of as civilized. Now in regard to the application of a multinational strike force for peace, this must exist and act according to dualosicate and without any badly getting out of control of the good human nature, indeed counter to all the very badly getting out of control of the good human nature that always came about since ancient times on the earth with all armies and wars, and which also occurs in the current time in ever worse form. Therefore, it means that in the battle there may only be killing in a last-minute emergency when there is no other possibility for the protection of the lives of the fighters of the multinational strike force for peace who are the innocent. The fundamental form of fighting and the actual fighting procedure of the troops concerning this is based, as I know from the Nokodemian storage bank data, in the opponent or opponents being surrounded with a considerable superior number, and then by means of all kinds of anesthetizing weapons, such as anesthetizing gas and other anesthetizing substances, as well as beam and shock weapons, and so forth, being made harmless and taken prisoner. After that the prisoners are interned in secure camps and so forth, as well as banished in certain cases. Therefore it is the case that a multinational strike force for peace fulfills its duties of dualsim and dualosicate in the face of wars, terrorism and atrocities, and so forth, and thereby protects the humanity in every regard, and therefore neither tortures, murders, kills nor rapes, and so forth. As I know in this regard from the storage banks, the multinational strike forces for peace of Nokodemian and Henok were therefore deployed in such a form that they firstly advanced with a great superiority of numbers and surrounded the opponents, and secondly they were not set up for killing and murder, rather only with appropriate means and weapons for making the opponent incapable of fighting. They thereby implemented the dualosicate. They had at their disposal diverse appropriate beam weapons as well as gases and other means with which they anesthetized the opponents and made them incapable of fighting, took them prisoner, and finally, under certain circumstances, if it was necessary, banished them or interned them in camps. But the majority of those who were suitable for freedom and were no further danger in regard to terror acts or acts of war could return to their everyday lives and to their families after some considerable time. The same principle would also be possible with us on the earth instead of killing and murdering, because also here on this world there exist gases and other substances which a multinational strike force for peace could use in order to stop opponents, make them incapable of fighting, in order to then intern them in camps, banish them, to ship them to deportation locations, or to let them go back to their everyday lives again and to their families, if they integrated themselves into peace and humaneness. But the Earthlings prefer to kill, murder, torture, and rape on one hand, and on the other hand, they are so greedy for profit that they much prefer to make war booty through theft and robbery, as well as maintaining munitions and weapons factories and so forth, through which they earn billions by deploying everything altogether for murderous wars and terrorism, whereby uncountable human beings die, are wounded, or become cripples. Monstrous destructions come about, and also a tremendous amount of nature and its fauna and flora is destroyed.
Whereby actually, with all forms of technology available on the Earth today, and with all the knowledge, it would be possible to form a multinational strike force for peace which would be equipped with all of the necessary means named by you. Consequently, with the usage tools aimed you all the psychic, no murder and killing would occur anymore. Effectively, through suitable means and substances, opponents or fallible ones and so forth would only be made incapable of fighting by means of anesthesia, in order to then intern them in suitable camps, keep them far from the society in secured places, or to banish them.
Thereby also serious felonies of individuals or groups against fellow human beings could be avoided, just as much as torture, wars, and all kinds of things which are very badly getting out of the control of the good human nature which go along with that, such as through the secret services and military of the user, to which also destruction, murderous religious and other sectarianism and terrorism belong, as is the case, for example, in regard to Islamist state and its ever-spreading offshoots, as well as the Taliban and so forth. And to be said in regard to is that the media, journalists, politicians in the world have still not comprehended and not understood that the is no Islamist state, rather it is a criminal militia which names itself Islamist state, and that therefore the is members are Islamist, and testifies to sheer stupidity, idiocy, unlogic and unintellect. The effective rightness and truth is namely that the real male and female Muslims are principally to be called Islamglabid or Islamitan. Consequently, there exists just as serious a difference between an Islamistan and an Islamitan as between Islamist state and Islamist state. But unfortunately also the language experts, linguists, dictionary publishers, and newspaper writers and so forth are not as educated and do not have such a good grasp in regard to the German language as the Plejadian learned ones concerning this. Consequently, they also do not think logically and can neither recognize the striking difference of these terms, nor can they convey and introduce them into the corresponding dictionaries and lexica and so forth.
Which actually is the case. Through a multinational strike force for peace also the USA would be stopped in its greed to be world police and in its abnormal might form. Consequently it could no longer act in its warmongering, annexing and criminal secret service and belligerent form.
Which would also mean that the interference of the USA in the EU dictatorship and in its idiotic dictatorship politics would come to an end, and thereby also the agitating against Russia, which is quite especially being driven in the EU by the German Chancellor Angela Merkel in cooperation with us America. The EU dictatorship of politics fires up the far-reaching conflict with Russia ever further, which can still lead to very grave consequences of the EU dictatorship, and above all Angela Merkel does not finally change course and instead of going towards bad confrontations with Russia, switch to a peaceful coexistence. If that does not happen, then ultimately the entirety of Europe and thereby also Switzerland will suffer, but also Russia and its member countries as well as the whole world.
That is certainly not to be doubted. If the EU carries on further in the same fire-stoking framework which is driven on by this Angela Merkel, who, in the EU, is the decisive fundamental power of all dictatorial affectation, dictatorship and diverse ambitions for might, incorporations of countries into the EU, and, regarding this, engrossments and wrong measures.
whereby it is not noticed and not understood by the masters of creation who are at the helm in their stupidity and idiocy, that they are manipulated by the reality a strange knave chancellor, just as they are deceived by these politicians and are used through and through for their secret and time-honored plans in regard to world control, which naturally also involves the striving toward interference in the EU dictatorship. And that is actually so, because she is effectively the decisive head person for the USA in order to put their secret and underhanded efforts of being able to interfere in the EU dictatorship into reality, and indeed in such a way that Angela Merkel works in the form of these American insinuations and accordingly works politically, manipulatively in the EU dictatorship. That is the reason why she is sought out and preferred by these politicians, and she does not notice, in her reality a strange naivety, that she is underhandedly and unhonestly used, seduced, and has her mind poisoned for these plans. Consequently, she acts according to these insinuations which are established in her by indoctrinating the mighty ones in the cunning form desired by the USA, and thereby prepares the way for a comprehensive influence of the USA in the EU dictatorship. All those who belong to the same ranks of the EU dictatorial ones are so much in bondage to the federal chancellor who has fallen into the reality a strange naivety that they do not notice how this woman has them all wrapped around her finger according to these plans, and that they are so indirectly manipulated by the USA. Therefore, the whole thing means that, in accord with the reality a strange naive actions and works of Angela Merkel and in line with these American fine details, all EU satellites are deceitfully trained for the USA playing a part in the EU dictatorship. But stupidity and idiocy just know no limits, as is the case with the federal chancellor, and indeed especially because she has a reality a strange naivety, and there be also one of the innumerable forms of a personality disorder, which is also connected with psychopathic forms and which leads to a might delusion. Also to say about that is that the reality a strange naivety has nothing to do with the actual naivety, that is to say the natural naivety, which is characteristic of many human beings and is innate at birth and is therefore to be called natural. The natural naivety, which is also called blue-eyedness and primal and harmlessly childish, can in a shortened form which has merged into the general language usage be regarded as naturalness, whereby arising from that human beings who are not able to appropriately evaluate verbal remarks, circumstances, actions and situations and so forth are generally called naive, for which reason the naivety in this form is also a synonym for gullible, innocent, easily deceivable or unknowledgeable. However, this natural form of naivety has in no form something to do with the reality a strange naivety, which appears in pathologically half-witted primal and foolish form and is based on pathological delusions as a consequence of wrong assessments of which the befallen human being is not conscious and which also cannot be recognized by the fellow human beings, and as a rule by experts. The delusion is based in reality a strange naive wrong estimations, wrong assessments and wrong interpretations in regard to expositions, presentations, things, decisions, clarifications, events, situations, occurrences, speech, facts and matters, as well as in lacking knowledge of human nature and so forth. Furthermore, also connected with that are personal wrong forms of viewing and considering, delusional believing, guilefulness, egoism, self-deceit, self-enticement, estrangement from reality and lack of recognition of reality. From that there arise wrong viewpoints and forms of understanding, and indeed because the reality of a matter and so forth is not comprehended, not recognized, and consequently also not appraised in a real correct form, and therefore can neither be assessed nor realistically evaluated. That leads to the effectively existing facts and actuality being completely wrongly interpreted, and consequently from that wrong and dangerous decisions being made, and naturally also correspondingly erroneous and confused actions being carried out, through which much terribleness is caused in many kinds of forms. And this is especially the case with reality a strange naive human beings, in regard to verbal utterances, presentations, explanations, as well as the modes of behavior and conduct of other human beings who get into the focus of one who is pathologically naive due to estrangement from reality, whereby it plays no role whether the entirety of the matter which gets into the attentiveness of the reality a strange naive one relates to something familial, societal, philosophical, political, private, religious, sectarian, or purely worldly. Thereby concerning this, everything is connected with anxieties about failure and persecution delusion which are suppressed outwardly for the fellow human beings to the point of not being detectable but which are masked by an especially pathologically hoggish commitment to a matter as well as through an extremely shrewd and indeed intelligent, suggestive dictatorial might demeanor as well as perfect play acting and a false competence demeanor. The entire thing works in this form on the fellow human beings such that a reality estranged knave one who acts in this form is wrongly appraised as being a very considerate, decisive human being who is sure in actions and is competent, and is therefore praised excessively. As your father Svahov already taught me, and as you taught me on various occasions and explained to me during the course of our friendship, the actual reality estranged naivety is to be labeled against intellect and rationality, literally also insane or also megalomaniacal. The whole thing is based pathologically on a serious inferiority complex and a psychical disorder which is transformed through self-deceit into megalomania and imperiousness and is outwardly play-acted as comprehensive competence, and is consequently not recognized by the fellow human beings and even by experts. In its center, this form of the reality estranged naivety is based on dominating delusions which call forth anxieties of failure, anxieties of persecution or, in the worst case, an acute persecution delusion, as well as a distorted perception of the effective, real reality and its truth. As a rule, human beings who are reality estranged naive fall into the same category as natural naive ones and suffer from the same symptoms as them, however are able to cover their reality estranged naivety and therewith their personality disorder so perfectly that, as I said, it cannot even be detected by experts, not to mention by lay people who are untrained concerning this. A reality estranged naive human being sees in his or her environment as well as by and large in descriptions, presentations, things, explanations, facts, events, speech, situations, and occurrences, and in any human being's a hostile and in extreme cases even malicious persecutory attitude towards him/her when all of it does not correspond to his or her own view and opinion and everything does not fit into his or her personal field of view and considering, understanding, rationality and desire nor into his or her endeavors and into his or her objectives. This is so while in regard to the same factors a human being in his or her reality estranged naivety just takes everything at face value and accordingly also unconcernedly and inconsiderately acts in the form suggested to him/her when he or she is led to believe that someone is of the same view and opinion and of the same mind as him/her. Fundamentally in his or her delusion, a reality estranged naive human being sees everything in an effectively reality estranged form and according to his or her own views and his or her personal opinion. Consequently, he or she assesses circumstances in a way that is confusingly wrong and even also condemns them. But that leads to completely wrong and confused views and a basically wrong opinion arising in him/her, which he or she suggestively conveys to fellow human beings, influences them according to his or her sense and brings them to his or her reality estranged naive confused line and turns them into blind followers without them perceiving that they are put under pressure and lured into the unreal. The reality estranged naive human being, like the actual natural naive one, is controlled by an anxious or aggressive mistrust in regard to other human beings, whereby the whole thing leads delusionally to the conviction that any human being who gets into his or her focus would plot against him/her. But paradoxically that does not prevent the reality estranged naive one from being like naturally naive human beings, namely innocent, childish, gullible, unknowing, easily deceived and simple-minded and foolish indeed being the normal naive one. Consequently, he or she cannot evaluate the events, actions, situations, circumstances and descriptions, things, insinuations, facts, lies, speech guidelines and calumnies and so forth which are suggestively introduced to him/her in any appropriate form. This is a fact that means that, also through the deceitfulness and other machinations of any human being, the reality estranged naive human being can in this form be extremely strongly negatively influenced and manipulated in a form which is not consciously perceptible for him/her. But it also means that a human being who is naive in a reality-estranged form in many regards is not able to recognize and understand in a reality-based form that which is effective and real, as well as views, statements, descriptions, things, events, opinions, and circumstances, and so forth. Rather wrongly interprets everything in a reality-estranged naive way, and therefore interprets the opposite to that which is basically given or meant. Therefore, through the reality-estranged naivety, there arises, from the human being befallen by it, a form of viewing and considering in regard to something from which there comes forth a wrong interpretation of the situation, and accordingly also a completely wrong appraisal opposite to the matter, as well as a wrong action and behavior. And exactly that is the case in regard to the Federal Chancellor Merkel, who in her reality-estranged naivety does not recognize the suggestive influences which are directed at her of the use as federally responsible politicians, and consequently is not able to recognize nor assess the effective scope of these as influences. Thereby she is an unknowing and willing plaything of the US politics, and, according to its sense, in the EU dictatorially directs the line and the mode of behavior of all the EU politicians, however completely unnoticed by the stupid idiotic mighty ones of the EU dictatorship. And this is because they do not know the true face of the Chancellor any more than they do the effective backgrounds which are given through the suggestive influencing by the US politicians, whereby the whole matter of the use of playing a part in the EU dictatorship is at the forefront, but also as America's world control desires, as well as a free trade agreement between the USA and the EU dictatorship. And when the spectrum of the reality-estranged naivety of which I talk is viewed and considered, then under certain circumstances, as with the actual reality-estranged human being, this reaches from neurotic inclinations to serious psychotic characteristics, however, which are so suppressed and veiled by the reality-estranged naive one that the whole thing cannot be perceived by the fellow human beings and even by trained experts. But under certain circumstances precisely that is extremely dangerous for the environment, and indeed especially in regard to politics, especially in the present connection which concerns the machinations of the EU dictatorship against Russia. As with an essentially neurotic human being, a reality-estranged naive one is characterized just as much by an exaggerated sensitivity regarding rejections, being easily aggrieved, and mistrust, which leads to him/her mindfully putting himself/herself in the foreground with Gewalt, lies, and deceit, bootlicking, and with all other conceivable means, and indeed even when he or she has to stop at nothing. In this form the reality-estranged human being who is befallen by delusion, and indeed in this form, having a personality disorder, believes that even neutral or friendly actions of other human beings are hostilely or disdainfully directed against him/her. In this form constantly recurring and unjustified accusations are delusionally raised by this kind of naive human being against all those fellow human beings who, as I already said, do not share his or her view and opinion, and do not fit into his or her schema of intellect and rationality, and also not into his or her objectives, which he or she extremely suggestively, jealously, dictatorially conveys to others, and where necessary also cantankerously fights for. Perhaps you can just explain what is to be understood by reality-estranged naivety, perhaps in the form as Svahoff explained it to me, and as you also precisely explained to me, and as I now have attempted to recall the whole thing to some extent. You as a skilled expert can do that certainly better than I can. To my knowledge, the term reality-estranged naivety is not known in the teaching of terrestrial medicine as well as psychology and psychiatry, and so forth, for which reason I think that a short explanation from you would certainly be good.
That which you have presented from my father's teaching and explanations, and from mine, is absolutely applicable and so detailed that actually everything necessary has thereby been said, but I will nonetheless happily still contribute something short about that. Fundamentally, like paranoia, reality-estranged naivety is characterized by a particular sensitivity regarding rejections, bearing grudges, being easily aggrieved, exaggerated mistrust, and so forth, whereby still to add to that is an inclination to interpret that which is experienced in the direction of tendencies which are hostile towards oneself. The reality-estranged naive human being rebels, through a deep-reaching might demeanor and through all kinds of similarly directed modes of behavior, and often also through revenge machinations against everything which does not correspond to his or her view and opinion construct, whereby, in this form, he or she exerts might over fellow human beings, which happens in extremely insidious form, and is not realized by those human beings who are involved in it. A further thing to say regarding that is that a reality-estranged knave human being, just like a paranoiac, defines neutral and friendly actions of others as hostile, pejorative or disparaging, whereby in this way these impulsations are also experienced by him/her in a thought-feeling-based form. Thereby, also a delusional jealousy emerges which is directed against the views, the opinions and might of others, who are deemed to be adversaries if they do not conform to his or her own reality-estranged knave modes of behavior. As a rule, the whole matter of the reality-estranged naivety also leads to unjustified suspicions in regard to an incapability of those fellow human beings who are viewed and considered to be stupid, and, in regard to intellect, rationality and the ability to make decisions as well as the ability to act, are viewed and considered to be without intellect and without rationality, and consequently, in line with the delusion of the reality-estranged knave human being, must be dictatorially taught correctly and guided through his or her intellect and rationality. That is the actual might behavior of the reality-estranged knave human being, who is additionally also stubborn and quarrelsome and brings this to the fore in such form that the fellow human beings, who are directed and suggestively dictatorially led by him/her do not perceive that they are steered selfishly and imperiously through the machinations of the reality-estranged knave one. Human beings with a reality-estranged knave personality disorder are controlled by a false and inflated self-worth delusion, and by a greatly exaggerated self-centeredness delusion, as well as by an insatiable egoism, and by an insistence on being right, whereby, under certain circumstances, the reality-estranged knave state can also be associated with a paranoid schizophrenia and an actual paranoia. Basically, in every case, a reality-estranged naivety concerns a psychical disorder, in which, significantly, also psychopathic influences are present. Consequently, therefore, a reality-estranged knave human being is without doubt, in a certain way, also a psychopath. This is a fact which, naturally, as a consequence of the perfect acting skill, the psychopath knows how to conceal outwardly so much that, as a rule, at least lay people, as well as very often also experts, are not able to perceive and therefore also not recognize, not define and not understand his or her personality disordered disposition. Consequently also the might-filled decisions, actions and modes of behavior of a reality-estranged knave human being are not recognized, which leads to the reality-estranged knave one, who, as a consequence of his or her psychopathy, has a pronounced acting capability at his or her disposal, being able to transfix the fellow human beings, deceive them, and win their unjustified trust, which often leads to quarrel and strife as well as to far-reaching unpeace among the human beings with whom they interact. And wars frequently arise, and acts of revenge and retribution as well as hate and destruction, if reality-estranged knave ones stoke the corresponding embers long enough until they become a blazing fire and inextinguishable conflagration.
Thank you for your explanation, whereby now that which is called reality-estranged naivety by you Plejadian is certainly also clearly explained, whereby, as I already have said, according to my knowledge, this form of naivety is unknown by terrestrial experts of medicine, psychology and psychiatry, and so forth.
That corresponds to correctness, because the corresponding experts, which they believe themselves to be, have never yet, since time immemorial, concerned themselves with this form of personality disorder, and indeed also not in a new time. That means that, in this regard, but also in regard to the entirety of the human psyche and its thus unfold forms of illnesses, maladies and disorders, and so forth, they still have very much to learn. And this is so because, up to the present time, in regard to the necessary cognitions and the necessary knowledge, they are so behind that they do not even know a third of the effective extent of all possible variations of that which exists and is possible in regard to human beings psychically getting very badly out of control of the good human nature, and in regard to psychical illnesses, suffering and disorders, and so forth. Thereby also to be heeded is that, in this regard, as a consequence of the growth of the population, continuously new forms and variations of psychical disorders emerge and therefore expand their manifoldness.
then it is clear why great unknowledge still prevails with the earthlings concerning this in the fields of medicine, psychology, and psychiatry, because when I think that regarding psychopathy alone several thousand variations appear, then the unknowledge is also understandable. It is thereby only regrettable that the physicians, psychologists and psychiatrists and other experts, which they often only believe themselves to be, consider themselves to be great and clever and are of the view that they would know everything necessary amply up to the ne plus ultra, consequently they would have nothing more to learn about that.
Contact Report 625 Translation, Part 5. Important note: this is an unofficial but authorized translation of a FIGU publication. Translator, DeepL Translator.
Indeed we should. And if I can touch on one subject, I will say that I have surveyed your greenhouse and garden, and also recorded everything for Quetzal. Everything, through the efforts of you and Sylvana, is in very good condition, and no longer exhibits any unworthiness, as it did just before, when all the greenhouse and garden management over the last few years was disastrous and no longer had anything to do with garden and greenhouse, but only with a wilderness chaos.
Thanks, that makes Sylvano and me happy. Stranger walkers and several passive members have also said that everything is fine again, after having been horrified by the state of the garden over the last few years. Others who had seen the state of chaos in the greenhouse expressed their opinion in the same way.
This is not surprising.
Of course not, because everything went back to the way I used to do it together with Sylvano. Although we had to loosen the soil with the rotary tiller again after many a year of lack of care, this was done within the normal range of about 8-10 so that the soil organisms were not killed. This is the opposite of what happens in many horticulture farms and especially in agriculture, where deep tillers and plowshares are used and the soil is ripped up and plowed up in an unreasonable and destructive way, which causes the soil organisms to be scooped up and die. So I have also ordered that the soil of the garden and the greenhouse be worked again as it was when I was still doing it myself, so that I now also work again with weeders, pendulum hoes, as well as with normal garden hoes and so on, and thus also take sensible action against the weeds, which consequently serve again as natural fertilizer. In addition, the garden and greenhouse soil has been reworked and the necessary natural organic fertilizer has also been incorporated, whereby I have tried to use a more effective microorganisms.
Contact Report 625 Translation, Part 6. Important note: this is an unofficial and unauthorized translation of a FIGU publication. Translator, Stefan. Zutt. Date of original translation, Friday, 3rd November 2017.
Which is a good thing.
Yes, indeed it is. But something else: time and again there are broadcasts on television concerning old incidents that have till this very day not been clarified and are mysterious or forfeited to conspiracy theories. Such broadcasts are very diverse and deal with all kinds of incidents and occurrences and are also repeatedly aired in a continuous way. This was lately also again the case with regard to Marilyn Monroe, who allegedly committed suicide on the night from the 4th to the 5th of August 1962. Ever since the death of the woman, it has repeatedly been said that she did not commit suicide but was murdered, which has however to this day by certain persons deliberately been portrayed as a conspiracy theory because the effective truth is not supposed to be truth. In that regard, I wonder why this happened and still happens today, because at that time Ascot explained to me that the assertion about suicide was not true, for Marilyn Monroe did actually not kill herself because in fact and truth she had been murdered, whereby the murderer was her longtime psychotherapist, whose name was Green or something like that. As Ascot also said, this fact was however concealed for political reasons, consequently this man was not brought to justice. But the actual reason for it, that is to say the details behind the murder, which is today still portrayed as suicide, were unfortunately not commented on by Ascot. It is also to be said that on the last show in this matter, which I have seen, the presumption was also expressed that it might have been a murder after all, and that this very Green or similar name could have committed it. This rhymes with what Ascot explained to me already in 1962 and on what I want to ask you whether you two know something about it, maybe.
I can say a few things about this, because there are exact records made by Ascot, which I have of course studied, but only during a time later than the event occurrence. At that time Ascot clarified everything in a good way, because it was an event of a kind that moved the human beings of the earth globally. She was able to clearly establish that Marilyn Monroe did not commit suicide, but was murdered, namely by her psychiatrist and therapist Dr. Ralph Greenson, whose actual birth name was Roma Greenspoon. He put the woman for years under strong medication by performing drug therapies with her and routinely administering her barbiturates and sedatives, which he obtained from an internist named Hyman Engelberg, who prescribed her many of the medications and which were in reality ordered by Greenson. These medications caused Marilyn Monroe to fall into a deep dependence on her medication and Greenson too, and to become increasingly miserable in terms of health and psyche, and namely the more often she received and took the medications from Greenson, some of which were also forcibly entered into her. On the evening of 4th August 1962, she was forced to take a larger dose of a strong sleep aid, namely pentobarbital, after which she became unconscious. And in fact things happened in the way that Greenson was then summoned to Marilyn Monroe, after her awakening, murdered her by an injection of the barbiturate chloral hydrate into the anus, as a result of which no injection was found anywhere on the body. However, Greenson was not held accountable for the insidious murder, because his act was covered up, whereby he was protected by the Kennedy clan, that is to say by John Fitzgerald and Robert Kennedy, on whose order he committed the murder. The reason for the murder was that Marilyn Monroe had a long, deep and very intimate liaison with the two brothers John and Robert Kennedy, which she wanted to make known to the public, as a result of hefty and serious disagreements with the Kennedy brothers. However, the two Kennedys wanted to and had to prevent this, so they made Greenson carrying out the murder. And that the two were eventually also murdered, namely John Fitzgerald on the 22nd November 1963 in Dallas, Texas, and Robert on the 6th of June 1968 in Los Angeles, California, led to a situation of ultimately them two could not be held accountable anymore, the same as Dr. Greenson, who died on 24th November 1979 in Los Angeles, California, whereby everything was shrugged off for the entire Kennedy clan, since from then on there was no longer any danger that Greenson could have been persuaded to confess if the truth had unexpectedly been found out and the whole thing had been made public.
So that's how it was and still is. Well, another problem for paleontology seems to be the Sphinx in Egypt, which is again and again reported about, just as it has recently been again, whereby all sorts of guesses are made and impossible things are claimed about the creator of the Sphinx. On that Quetzal told me, as you however also said already in the 1980s, that according to your records Pharaoh Chephren, that is to say Chephren, was the builder, that is to say originator for the building of the Sphinx. Can you explain a little more about that?
Which is really like that. Chephren, that is to say Chefchafu or Chifren, is the Greek name for Chepher or Chafer, which means chafer is bag. He was the fourth pharaoh of the fourth dynasty in the Old Kingdom of Egypt. Pharaoh Chephren was the half-brother of his predecessor Rajaf and the half-brother of Kawab, and he was buried in Giza, as was his father Pharaoh Cheops, who was actually called Chufu. His reign lasted from 2567 to 2534 before Manuel, that is to say before the Christian calendar. He was also the originator and responsible for the construction of the temple and 12 statues, which showed the hours of daytime by sunlight. In addition, he was also the originator and responsible for the construction of the second highest pyramid in Giza, as well as for numerous outstanding statues in the Sphinx vicinity, some of which have been preserved to this day. With regard to the construction of the Giza pyramids, however, it should be noted that the first pyramids were built around 300 years ago, but were later again demolished, because they had deteriorated more and more due to the weather and the climatic influences. 800 years ago they were then rebuilt, which was due to the initiative of a king, that is to say Pharaoh Salak, who ordered the dismantling and modification of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Once again the pyramids fell to decay, because the weather conditions and the depletion of the pyramidal material had become so rampant in the course of the next millennia that about 4,500 years ago, when Cheops and Chephren dealt with the construction of the new pyramids, a complete rebuilding was necessary. Everything had to be torn away, reassembled and thus rebuilt, whereby the large stone slabs were also carved out of the hard underground around the Sphinx and used to build the temple, the statues, and the pyramid. So new square stone blocks were cut and used to build the temple and the Chephren pyramid. The Cheops pyramid was, of course, created under the direction of Pharaoh Cheops, who had it completely rebuilt and remodeled, while 300 years ago it was traced back to partially non-terrestrial builders, when non-terrestrials from the constellation of Orion were present in ancient Egypt, participated in the construction of the first pyramids and set themselves up as gods. The Great Pyramid was together with the others already in the early days and then also for the last recreation aligned on the Orion constellation, but the Sphinx according to the guidelines of Chephren on the Leo constellation. 500 years ago, the pyramids and the Sphinx were built solely by human beings, the Earth, whereas in the first construction 300 years ago non-terrestrials were also involved, partly using telekinetic powers.
Yes, you already told me this in the 1980s, as well as that the actual Egyptians who built the pyramids 500 years ago were mostly free human beings and craftsmen, while only a small part of them had to work as slaves. The food for all the workers, who comprised a small army, was, so to speak, provided by a food city not far from the pyramid, as well as facilities with dormitories were given for the workers.
Yes, that had been so.
I would then like to talk about the four groups, and I am particularly interested in whether you have gained new insights in recent months regarding the non-terrestrial as well as the Earth of the future group.
There are some new cognitions, which I do not want to mention openly, but only in a discreet way, and which shall be meant for you alone.
Whatever you say.
Then I can say the following in this regard.
That is interesting, and then it remains so that you do not make contacts with the two groupings and that you remain unknown and not present for them.
That is right.
Then a question regarding what you once told me, namely that in the United States there is a grouping, that is to say a secret organization, that is very well concerned with the things about extraterrestrials and their flying apparatuses and so on, but which in terms of its machinations, knowledge and experiences is, however, shielding itself not only from the public but also in relation to the US president and the senior rulers, so that they are all left in unknowledgeness and not informed. Is that still the case today?
Yes, and this corresponds to an undisputable but extremely secret fact, whereby the responsible ones of this grouping are also anxious to deny and conceal their machinations, cognitions, and experiences about non-terrestrials, the way these are given regarding non-terrestrial existences, activities, relations and incidents and so on. This grouping, that is to say secret organization, also poses a great danger to persons who make certain observations regarding so-called UFOs, as well with regard to secret activities that originate from the grouping. Particularly when observing persons want to get to the bottom of the matter and thus create elucidation, they run the risk of getting caught up in the cogwheels of the secret organization and being gone after or even harmed should it end with nothing but harming.
What do you mean by great danger? Must it be understood as danger to life and disappearing from the scene?
That corresponds to what I mean.
Then we are as in the past, back with the dark-dressed ones who also followed Gilgamesh. You are certainly still able to remember that, don't you?
Of course.
What do you think of the fact that my predictions, which I have been making time and again since 1951 with regard to the upcoming refugee phenomenon and the migration of folks, are now being fulfilled?
It was to be expected, because although you wrote to government, newspapers, journals, radio stations and organizations and sent them your predictions, everything was ignored and no one ever cared about your warning and predictions. And this is also true of your warnings, which have been ignored and continue to be disregarded in relation to the catastrophically increasing overpopulation, which should already from the 1950s onwards have been drastically stopped. And the same also applies to the worldwide birth stop and the equally worldwide birth control, which you have proclaimed and which are unavoidable and still necessary, because the present and further on unstoppably increasing overpopulation mass, with all the resulting ascertainment to evils and destructions, calls into question the continued existence of the human being of the earth. Contrary to the fact that you should have been heard and the necessary measures should have been taken, you were only ridiculed and insulted as a do-gooder, just as your predictions were also abused to put meaningless and facts-twisting newspaper articles into the world. Now the time has come, however, for which you have predicted and announced the migration of folks and the streams of refugees. All government and their responsible ones, as well as all folks and the individual human beings of the earth, have had more than half a century to prevent the entire refugee phenomena and the migration of folks that is now taking place. Instead of ridiculing you, insulting and slandering you, your warnings and predictions have been listened to, and if the respective measures necessary for that have been taken and implemented. But now it is too late, because the course of all those things that you have foretold warningly for well over half a century can no longer be stopped, as a result of which all future things will take shape according to what you wrote again on 21st July 2015 in your predicting summary environmental destruction as a result of the overpopulation. And that everything will come about as you put it, there is no doubt in my mind.
For the most part, these are just facts that we two discussed together.
That is right, but there are several things mentioned in the article that correspond to your probability calculations, which I can only confirm by my own calculations after having studied the article.
I didn't know that.
All the fact concerning migration of folks and refugee streams that you have written and disseminated in your warning and predictions since the 1950s would be valuable for incorporating them as excerpts in a special article, in which it shall be pointed out what I said earlier. By this I mean that you have all these years since 1951 been trying to make public the looming problem of the migration of folks into the masses of refugees, with warnings and predictions, but that no one has listened to you, that you rather heavily been ridiculed and insulted.
Do you mean that one should copy the relevant passages in the predictions and work them through and incorporate them into a corresponding article?
Yes, and not you shall do this work, but anyone else.
Then I will think about it and ask around who wants to write this article. In addition, I will also select the appropriate parts of the predictions and copy them.
Good. But now, my dear friend, I still want to discuss some important things with you, which should only be discussed between us. And further, I also want to talk to you briefly in a private way.
Of course, then so be it.